The sky above the Imperial Palace was the color of old blood and burning promethium when the lightning came. Not the pale, flickering discharge of failing void shields, not the actinic snap of plasma weaponry cooking the air to glass. This was something older, something that tore through the warp-stained clouds with a sound like worlds breaking, and for 3 heartbeats every Vox channel across the throne world went silent, with a static that tasted of ozone and forgotten names. Rogel Dawn felt it in his bones before his auspex shrieked confirmation. The Praetorian of Terra stood upon the ultimate wall, his plate still radiating heat from the last bombardment, and watched a pillar of gold-white brilliance punch down through the roiling sky to strike somewhere in the shattered gardens of the inner palace. The impact crater bloomed like a new sun. Seismic sensors screamed. 3 kilometers away, a company of Imperial fists braced against the shockwave that rolled outward in a perfect circle, flattening wreckage that had already been flattened twice before. His gene-enhanced mind processed 1,000 tactical variables in the span of a breath. New enemy drop. Psychic manifestation. Warp rift. Weapon test gone catastrophically wrong. None of the patterns fit. The energy signature was wrong in ways that made his Betcher's gland flood his mouth with acid. It did not read as warp spawn. It did not read as anything in the Mechanicum's exhaustive archives of destruction. It read as alive. All units. Convergence pattern thrown 7 actual. Dawn voxed, his voice flat as a tombstone lid. Custodian guard, seal the inner approaches. If it moves toward the Sanctum Imperialis, kill it. No warnings, no hesitation. He was already moving, mag-locking Storm's teeth to his thigh as he descended the wall in leaping strides that would have shattered a mortal's legs. Around him, his sons fell into formation with the wordless efficiency of warriors who had been dying by inches for 60 days straight. They no longer asked questions. They no longer required inspiration. They were stone-given breath, and they would hold until the stone crumbled to dust. The gardens had been beautiful once. Dawn remembered walking them with his foster grandfather in what felt like another life, discussing the elegance of Terran architecture and the necessity of fortification. Now they were a maze of rubble and corpse pyres, the ancient trees burned to skeletal fingers clawing at the poisoned sky. The crater sat in what had been a meditation grove. The grass was gone, the stone was gone. There was only fused earth radiating heat in shimmering waves, and at its center, something that should not exist. A man, golden-haired, clad in armor that caught the firelight and threw it back in shades that hurt to perceive directly, as though the metal itself remembered what it meant to be pure. He was on one knee, head bowed, one fist pressed to the scorched ground. In his other hand, he held a hammer. No, not a hammer. An idea of a hammer, rendered in something too dense to be matter. It was smaller than a thunder hammer, perfectly balanced, inscribed with runes that writhed when Dawn tried to focus on them. The head hummed with a subsonic frequency that made his back teeth ache. Arcs of lightning, hair-thin and white-hot, played across its surface in patterns that repeated but never quite the same way twice. The stranger rose. He was tall, perhaps 2.5 meters, massive by human standards, but still half a head shorter than the Primarch, now closing to engagement range. His eyes opened, and they were the blue of Terra's sky before the pollution, before the war, before the Warmaster's treachery had turned paradise into an abattoir. Heimdall, the stranger said, his voice resonant and confused, speaking Gothic with an accent Dawn could not place. Heimdall, the coordinates were wrong. This is not... He stopped, looked up, saw the burning palace, the traitor fleet in low orbit trailing fire, the sky full of murder. Saw Rogel Dawn and 20 legions Astartes with bolters aimed at his chest. Something like sorrow crossed the stranger's face, deep and old and terrible. No, he whispered. Not again. The hammer came up in a fighter's guard, and lightning danced between its claws. Storm's teeth cleared leather. His gene-engineered mind calculated firing solutions, enemy reach, collateral damage to the surrounding architecture, calculated and discarded. This required answers first, bullets later. "Identify yourself," the Praetorian commanded, his voice carrying the weight of a gene-sire who had never learned to compromise. "You stand upon the soil of the throne world during the siege of Terra. You will submit to imperial authority, or you will be destroyed. There is no third option." The stranger's eyes met his, and for a moment, Dawn saw something in them that gave him pause. Not fear, not madness, recognition. As though this golden warrior had stood in similar moments before, in other wars, on other worlds where civilizations tore themselves apart. "My name," the stranger said slowly, weighing each word, "is Thor Odinson. I am of Asgard, and I did not mean to come here." His gaze drifted to the hammer in his hand, and something like doubt flickered across his features. "Mjolnir brought me, but I do not understand why." Behind Dawn, Sergeant Camba Diaz's targeting lock acquired and held. 50 meters beyond the crater's edge, Captain Archimus and a Huskal squad completed their encirclement. In the distance, the distinctive thud, thud, thud of Custodian Guardian spears striking the ground in unison announced the arrival of the Emperor's own. The stranger, Thor, lowered his hammer slightly, a gesture of tentative peace. Lightning still crawled across his shoulders, into his hair, earthing itself in the scorched ground with sharp cracks. "Please," he said, and there was an ache in the word that made it something more than a request. "I can hear your world screaming. Tell me how to help." Dawn's finger rested on Storm's teeth's trigger. The sensible choice was to execute this unknown factor immediately. The strategic choice was to contain and interrogate. The Praetorian of Terra, who had fortified 100 worlds and never once compromised his principles, made a third choice that surprised even himself. "Lower your weapon," he said, slowly. "Then we will talk." Thor hesitated. Behind him, the crater still glowed, and in its depths, something that was not quite warp residue and not quite real flickered like a half-healed wound in the skin of space. He lowered the hammer. The sky above them shrieked as another traitor bombardment began its descent. The Custodian Guard did not negotiate. They arrived in a wedge of aura might and absolute authority. 20 warriors whose genecraft made even Legiones Astartes seem like rough drafts of a perfect design. At their head strode Tribune Aranthis Morovan, his guardian spear held in the parade rest position that was somehow more threatening than any combat stance. His helmet's eye lenses glowed a deep, arterial red as he scanned the stranger, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of certainty that made even Primarchs pause. "Step away from the anomaly, Lord Dorn." Not a request. This falls under Legio Custodes jurisdiction. Psychic manifestation within the inner palace threshold. Protocol Amber 17. Dawn did not move. His Storm's teeth remained holstered, but his posture shifted fractionally, placing himself between the Custodians and Thor in a way that could have been accidental if the Praetorian ever did anything accidentally. "The entity claims to be human. It speaks Gothic. It has made no hostile action since arrival. It arrived on a pillar of unidentified energy that registered on Auspex as far as the Mercury orbital platforms," Morovan countered. The Custodian's formation tightened, a noose of gold that knew exactly how to kill gods. "It carries a weapon of unknown provenance that emits radiation in spectra our Mechanicum attachés cannot classify. During a siege, while demons walk the palace walls." His helm tilted toward Thor with the focused attention of a predator selecting which bone to break first. "If it is human, it will survive our interrogation. If it is not, the master of mankind will be safer for its termination." Thor had remained silent through this exchange, but now he spoke, his accent lending strange music to the Gothic words. "I understand your suspicion. In your position, I would hold the same." He kept his hands visible, the hammer resting loosely in his right palm. "But I swear by the All-Father that I mean you no harm. I am a warrior. I have fought in many wars, on many worlds. If your enemy is at your gates, then point me toward them, and I will prove my worth in deed rather than words." "The All-Father," Morhavan repeated, and there was something razored beneath the curiosity. "You reference the Emperor?" Thor hesitated, confusion creasing his features. "No, I speak of Odin, King of Asgard, who—" He stopped as he saw the effect his words had. Every bolter in a 50-meter radius swung to aim at his center mass. The custodian's spears lowered into killing positions with mechanical precision. Dawn's voice cut through the sudden tension like a blade through silk. "You claim to serve another god-king, while standing in the shadow of the Imperial Palace, during a war begun by a son who thought himself worthy of godhood." The Praetorian's eyes were chips of flint. "You understand how this appears?" Thor's jaw tightened. For a moment, lightning flared brighter around his shoulders, and the hammer in his hand hummed with barely restrained power. Then, deliberately, he drove Mjolnir point first into the scorched earth and released it. The weapon stood upright, crackling softly, while Thor spread his arms in a gesture of submission that looked like it cost him something vital. "I am not your enemy," he said quietly, "but I will not beg. If you mean to kill me, then do it cleanly. I have died before. I can die again." The silence that followed tasted of Prometheum's smoke and possibilities. It was broken by a new voice, sharp and mechanical, speaking in the clipped binaric accented Gothic of the Martian Mechanicum. "Termination would be inefficient, Tribune Morhavan. Prior to disposal, we must extract data." The Mechanicum delegation that emerged from the rubble looked like priests of a religion whose god was mathematics. Magos Dominus Urzi Malevolus led them, his crimson robes barely concealing the augmetic forest beneath. Servo arms bristled from his back like a spider's legs, each tipped with scanning equipment that swept Thor in overlapping sensor sweeps. His face was more lens than flesh, compound optics whirring and clicking as they adjusted focal lengths. "The energy signature is unprecedented," Malevolus continued, his remaining organic vocal cords trembling with something approaching religious ecstasy. "Radiation spectra include wavelengths that correlate with theoretical models of pre-Old Night technology, possibly STC adjacent, possibly older." A manipulator arm extended toward Thor, sparking with test voltage. The subject's cellular structure withstands ambient radiation that should induce immediate necrosis in unaugmented human tissue. The weapon's material composition defies mass spectrometry. This is a miracle of the motive force, and you propose to destroy it unexamined. Morhavan's spear did not waver. "The safety of the master of mankind supersedes your curiosity, Magos." "Then contain rather than terminate," Malevolus shot back. "We have containment protocols, stasis fields, null chambers lined with blackstone from the Cadian Gate. Give me 6 hours of controlled observation before you reduce a potentially priceless artifact to constituent atoms." Dawn watched this debate with the expressionless patience of a man who had spent 2 months watching his sons die in increments. His tactical assessment was already complete. Thor was a variable. Variables in siege warfare meant unpredictability. Unpredictability meant weakness in the defensive line. The equation was simple, except it was not. Because Thor had lowered his weapon when asked. Because his eyes held the specific weight of someone who had seen too many walls fall and too many brothers burn. Because the way he stood, even unarmed, even surrounded, radiated the kind of bone-deep competence that Dawn recognized in his best company captains. And because, Emperor, forgive him, Rogel Dawn was so very tired of having too few warriors and too many enemies. Magos malevolus, the Praetorian said, his decision made and already being second-guessed by the part of his mind that never slept. You have 3 hours. Containment protocols Sigma 9, full Auspex monitoring. At the first sign of warp taint, psychic activity or aggression, Tribune Moravan will execute the subject with extreme prejudice. He turned his gaze to Thor. You will submit to scanning, interrogation, and restraint. You will answer every question with complete honesty. If you resist, if you lie, if you attempt to retrieve your weapon, you will die. Understood? Thor met his eyes, and something like respect flickered there. Understood, Lord Dawn. He paused. That is your title, yes? Your warriors called you Praetorian. I am Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the 7th Legion, Praetorian of Terra, and the man who will kill you if you prove false. No threat in the words. Simple fact. Your hammer will be secured separately. You will not see it again unless you earn that privilege. The hammer is bound to me, Thor said carefully. It may not. He was interrupted by a scream that turned every head. Not a human scream. Something wet and multidimensional that came from the crater's edge, where the air had begun to tear like rotten cloth. The half-healed wound Thor's arrival had left in reality was opening again, and through it poured a stink of copper and burning hair and something underneath that made Dawn's gene-enhanced brain shriek contamination warnings. 3 things happened simultaneously. The crater vomited a blood letter, all brass and rage and serrated edges, shrieking its god's name as it materialized fully into real space. Tribune Moravan's guardian spear sang as it left his hand, crossing 15 meters to punch through the demon's chest with a crack of disruption field energy. And Thor Odinson called his hammer. Mjolnir tore free of the earth with a sound like thunder speaking its own name, crossed the distance to Thor's outstretched hand faster than cogitators could track, and the stranger was suddenly moving, closing with the dying demon as 2 more of its kindred clawed through the widening tear. Lightning turned the garden white. When Dawn's eyes adjusted, Thor stood over 3 piles of dissipating warp matter, breathing hard, his armor scorched but intact. The tear was sealed. The hammer crackled in his grip, hungry and satisfied in equal measure. He turned to face Dawn's leveled storm's teeth, and there was apology in his expression, but no regret. You needed proof, Thor said simply. Now you have it. The interrogation chamber was 30 meters beneath the surface, carved from bedrock that predated the Unification Wars, lined with hexagrammic wards that made Dawn's teeth ache just standing near the threshold. Thor sat in a chair built for warriors twice his size, his hands resting unbound on the table between them, while around the room's perimeter a dozen gun servitors tracked his every breath with multi-barreled certainty. Dawn sat across from him. No guards, no custodians, just the Primarch and the stranger, with only truth and lies between them. Tell me about Asgard, Dawn said. Thor's expression flickered with something that might have been homesickness, or might have been grief. They looked similar on a warrior's face. Asgard was, a realm beyond your stars, a place built by those who came before, where the boundaries between what you call real and what you might call myth grow thin. His fingers drummed once against the table, a nervous tell. My people are long-lived, strong. We have fought across the 9 realms for millennia, holding back the darkness that always presses against the light. Gods, Dawn said flatly. We never called ourselves that. Thor's jaw tightened. But others did. And perhaps we were too proud to correct them, or too foolish to understand what such belief would cost. He met Dawn's eyes. "You do not believe in gods, Praetorian. I can see it in the way you hold yourself, the way you measure me like a fortification to be assessed and overcome. Good. I am not here to ask for worship. I am here because something brought me, and I do not yet understand why." Dawn activated a hololith projector embedded in the table. It showed the energy signature from Thor's arrival, rendered in 3 dimensions, with spectral analysis scrolling alongside. "The Mechanicum believes your arrival tore a hole in reality, a small one, barely 10 meters across. But in the current strategic situation, even small warp rifts can metastasize into planet-killing incursions within hours." He rotated the image. "You sealed it. With lightning. How?" "Mjolnir channels the storm," Thor said, as though this explained anything. "Where I come from, we learned to shape the primal forces, not through the corruption you call chaos. I have tasted that poison now, in those creatures, but through resonance, harmony. The hammer was forged in the heart of a dying star, crafted by those who understood that matter and energy and will can be braided into something greater." He paused. "I know how that sounds to you, like myth, like madness, but I have no other words. The Mechanicum thinks your hammer predates the dark age of technology," Dawn said, "that it represents a manufacturing paradigm we have forgotten. They want to disassemble it." Thor's expression went very still. "They will fail. Mjolnir answers only to me. It is bound by oaths older than your species' recorded history." His voice dropped. "And if they try to force the matter, the hammer will defend itself. I tell you this not as a threat, but as a warning between warriors. Some weapons have wills of their own." Dawn studied him for 3 full seconds, those gene-enhanced eyes cataloging micro-expressions, pupil dilation, blood flow patterns in the carotid artery. Thor did not look away, did not flinch. Whatever else he was, he believed what he was saying with the absolute conviction of someone who had never learned to lie well. "You said you have died before," the Primarch said quietly. "Explain." The silence stretched. Thor's hands closed into fists on the table, then deliberately relaxed. "There are places beyond death," he said finally. "Realms where the worthy go to feast and fight until the final battle. I have walked there, been cast out, returned." His voice was dust and ashes. "I have lost brothers to death's country and brought them back through paths your emperor would call heresy. I have defied gods and fate and the natural order of things because I was too stubborn to accept that some losses are permanent." "And yet here you sit, alone," Dawn observed. "No brothers, no army, no realm to return to." Thor flinched as though struck. "Asgard stands," he said, but there was doubt in it now. "It must, unless—" His eyes widened slightly, terrible understanding dawning. "Unless the Bifrost sent me here because there was nowhere left to send me, unless I am the last, and this is exile disguised as deployment." Dawn recognized that look. He had seen it in the mirror every morning since Horus turned traitor and the galaxy fell into screaming ruin. The look of a warrior realizing that everything he fought to protect might already be ash. "Then you understand," the Praetorian said, and there was something almost gentle in the granite of his voice. "You understand what it means to stand on walls you know will fall, to spend lives like coins, knowing the purse will eventually empty, to make the calculus of sacrifice and find the equation always balances in blood." He leaned forward. "My brother has betrayed me. Half my father's realm burns. I have turned the most beautiful city in human history into a mass grave, and I will salt that grave with the bodies of my own sons before I let the Warmaster take it. This is my siege. This is my war. And you appear in the midst of it, claiming to be a warrior and a god and a stranger all at once, asking how you can help." Yes, Thor said simply. Why? Dorn's question cut like a blade. You owe us nothing. By your own admission, you may be a refugee from a fallen realm. You could take your hammer and tear open the sky and flee to wherever entities like you flee to. Why stand on a wall that is not yours? Thor was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. Because I have fled before, Praetorian. I have chosen survival over sacrifice, safety over duty, and every time I have awakened in comfortable exile, wondering if my father was right to think me unworthy. His blue eyes held depths of old pain. I am not wise. I am not clever. But I am very, very good at standing in the gap when everything has gone to hell, and I have learned that sometimes that is enough. He spread his hands. You need warriors. I am a warrior. The mathematics are simple. Dorn sat back, his expression unreadable. In the silence, distant explosions rattled the compound, another bombardment from the traitor fleet. Somewhere above them, his sons were dying by inches while he sat in judgment of a storm wrapped in flesh. The Primarch of the 7th Legion, who had never made an emotional decision in his life, made one now. You will be assigned to the Inner Palace Defense under Captain Archimus of my Huskarls. You will be given limited access to munitions, medical supplies, and strategic briefings. You will wear a Vox collar that allows us to track your position and vital signs at all times. At the first sign of warp taint, possession, or treachery, a cyclonic charge embedded in that collar will detach your head from your shoulders. No emotion in the recitation. You will not approach within 1 kilometer of the Sanctum Imperialis. You will not interact with other Primarchs without my direct authorization. You will surrender your hammer for Mechanicum study for a period of no less than 6 hours per day, during which you will be confined to quarters. Thor opened his mouth to protest the last point, then closed it, nodded slowly. Acceptable. Do not mistake this for trust, Dorn continued. I am granting you the opportunity to prove yourself useful. Nothing more. The moment you become a liability, I will kill you myself. Are we clear? Perfectly clear, Lord Dorn. Thor rose, and even unarmed, even collared, he moved with the unconscious grace of something built for war. May I ask one question? Dorn nodded permission. The Emperor, Thor said carefully. Your warriors speak of him with reverence that borders on worship, yet you call yourselves secular. Your custodians defend him with a zealotry I have only seen in the most fervent of devotees. And your brother, this Warmaster Horus, he rebelled. Why? What manner of being inspires such extremes of loyalty and betrayal? Dorn was silent for so long that Thor thought he would not answer. When the Praetorian finally spoke, his voice was soft as a knife through silk. He is our father. He is the architect of human ascendancy, and the tyrant who will accept nothing less than absolute dominion. He is the most brilliant mind our species has ever produced, and the coldest heart that has ever beaten in a human chest. Dorn's eyes were somewhere else, seeing a golden figure on a throne that no longer left. He created us to be his weapons, and we have been very good weapons. But Horus looked into our father's eyes and saw something there that broke him. Truth or lie, I do not know. I know only that the fracture spread, and now we bleed. Thor absorbed this, and something like understanding crossed his features. I know what it is to serve a father whose plans span millennia. To be the hammer he wields without asking what he builds or what he destroys. His voice dropped. And I know what it is to wonder, in the dark hours, if perhaps the rebellious brother saw something true that the loyal sons refused to face. That line of thinking is treason, Dorn said, but there was no heat in it. Perhaps, Thor agreed. But we both know that the hardest truths are often treasonous, until they are proven. The Primarch stood, the interview clearly concluded, but at the threshold, he paused and spoke without turning. "You mentioned dying before, and returning." A moment's hesitation, barely perceptible. "My brother Ferrus Manus fell at Istvan V. His head was taken as a trophy. His gene-sons still hear his voice in the dark, calling them to revenge." Another pause. Can those who return from death's country ever truly return? Or do they come back wrong? Thor's response was barely a whisper. "I do not know, Praetorian, but I fear you will learn the answer before this siege is done." The door sealed behind Dawn with the finality of a tomb. The bloodthirster came through the eastern wall at midnight on Thor's third day in the palace. He was standing post on the Colossi Gate approach, watching the horizon burn with the colors of a world dying by degrees, when the wall simply exploded outward in a spray of rockcrete and ceramite and screaming. The demon was 4 meters of brass and muscle and serrated plate, its axe the size of a rhino transport, and it burst into the courtyard trailing fire and the wet meat stink of the warp with a bellow that shattered windows 3 levels up. Thor's vox collar crackled. Captain Archimus somewhere in the chaos. "All units, Bloodthirster Manifestation Grid 77 Epsilon, fall back to second line, pattern Gorgon 3. Do not engage without heavy weapons support." Thor was already moving. He had spent 3 days under Archimus's command, learning the rhythms of a siege he had not started, and one lesson had been beaten into him with every patrol, every watch rotation, every moment spent waiting for death to find new angles. The Legiones Astartes did not panic. They did not freeze. They calculated, communicated, and killed with the efficiency of a machine that happened to bleed. But machines could be too slow when hell came calling. Mjolnir sang as it leapt into his palm. The Mechanicum had released it after 6 hours of fruitless scanning had produced only migraine-inducing data, and Thor launched himself across the courtyard in 3 ground-eating strides. Lightning crackled up his arms, earthing itself through his boots in sharp cracks that left smoking footprints on stone. The bloodthirster pivoted toward him with predatory speed, its brass collar flaring with unholy light as it registered prey. When it spoke, its voice was 1,000 slaughterhouse floors given tongue. "Aesir spawn, I smell thee. Khorne cares not from which realm the skulls fall." Thor's response was to hurl Mjolnir with every ounce of strength the All-Father had bred into his bones. The hammer crossed 20 meters in the span of a heartbeat, trailing lightning like a comet's tail, and struck the demon square in its horned skull with a crack that rattled the remaining windows in their frames. The bloodthirster staggered. Blood that steamed and hissed where it struck stone gushed from a crater in its forehead, and its roar of pain was a beautiful thing. Then it tore the hammer free and threw it back. Thor caught Mjolnir on instinct, but the impact drove him back 3 paces, his boots scoring deep grooves in the courtyard stone. The demon was strong, stronger than storm giants, stronger than frost titans, strong enough that its next axe swing carved a trench 2 meters deep where Thor had been standing a second before. He rolled, came up swinging, Mjolnir connecting with the demon's knee in a discharge of lightning that made the air taste like burnt copper. Brass buckled. The bloodthirster dropped to one leg, and Thor was already capitalizing, the hammer coming around in a tight arc aimed at the thing's throat. The axe caught him across the ribs. His armor, forged in Nidavellir and proof against frost and flame and the vacuum of space, held. Barely. The impact launched him 15 meters backward, and he hit the courtyard wall hard enough to crack the stones behind him. His ribs screamed. Blood filled his mouth, hot and coppery. The vox collar at his throat squawked damage warnings in a language he was still learning. The bloodthirster advanced, limping but inexorable, its ruined knee already knitting itself back together with the obscene vitality of the warp. "Weak," it rumbled. Your lightning tickles, your thunder is the mewling of prey. It raised the axe for a killing blow. Khorne sends you back to whatever corpse god spawned you. Thor spat blood and grinned through split lips. I have fought worse than you on better days, and I am not weak. He slammed Mjolnir into the ground. The lightning that answered was not a bolt. It was a column, white gold and furious, that tore down from the storm-choked sky with a sound like the universe taking a breath before screaming. It struck Thor, struck the hammer, struck the earth, and the feedback loop turned the courtyard into a maelstrom of arcing electricity that jumped from rubble to wall to demon with hungry, indiscriminate appetite. The bloodthirster's roar became something higher-pitched. Its brass armor, consecrated in the forges of the blood god, became a conductor. Every rune etched into its flesh became a channel for power that the warp had not prepared it for. It thrashed, convulsed, and for 3 long seconds, Thor held the lightning, held the pain, held the connection between sky and earth, while his bones felt like they were vibrating apart. Then he released it. The courtyard went dark. Smoke rose from a dozen small fires. The bloodthirster lay in a crater of fused glass, its form already beginning to discorporate, brass flaking away in ash-gray chunks. It managed one final sentence before the warp reclaimed it. The Skull Throne remembers. Thor collapsed to one knee, gasping, every nerve ending screaming. The hammer was hot enough in his grip that he could smell his own palm burning against the leather wrapping. His vision swam with after-images, somewhere distant. He could hear bootfalls, voices, the mechanical efficiency of warriors converging on his position. Captain Archimus reached him first, bolter raised but not aimed, his helmeted head swiveling between Thor and the smoking crater. When he spoke, his vox grill made his voice flat as a burial shroud. You were ordered to fall back. It would have reached your secondary line in 40 seconds, Thor managed between breaths. Killed 20 warriors, maybe more. He looked up, met the blank stare of the helmet. I chose to prevent that. You chose to ignore a direct order during siege operations, Archimus corrected. Around them, Imperial fists had formed a perimeter, their bolters trained outward, scanning for additional threats. The Huskarl captain's gauntlet closed around Thor's shoulder, not gently. In my legion, we call that insubordination. Lord Dawn calls it unreliability. Both are grounds for termination of field deployment privileges. Thor's temper, already frayed by pain and proximity to chaos, flared. I am not one of your legions Astartes. I am not built for your formations, your protocols, your rigid doctrine of warfare that treats soldiers like components in a machine. He shrugged off the captain's grip, immediately regretted the motion as his ribs shrieked protest. I am a warrior who sees a threat and ends it. That is what you brought me here to do. We brought you here to follow orders, Archimus said, and there was permafrost in those words. To integrate into a defensive structure that has held against impossible odds, because every warrior knows their role and executes it without improvisation. You are not special, Odinson. You are an asset, and assets that cannot be relied upon are discarded. The gathered Imperial fists said nothing, but Thor could feel their judgment like a physical weight. These warriors had spent months bleeding for every meter of ground, watching their brothers die in fire and treachery. And here stood an outsider who thought he knew better after 3 days. He forced himself to his feet, forced his voice to something approaching calm. You are right, Captain. I apologize. The words tasted like ash. It will not happen again. Archimus studied him for a long moment, weighing sincerity against the tactical realities of a siege that had already killed 3 company captains and showed no signs of mercy. Finally, see that it does not. You are assigned to Apothecary Theron for wound assessment, Then report to Tribune Morovan. The custodians wish to discuss your performance. The way he said discuss made it sound like vivisect. Thor retrieved Mjolnir, still hot, still crackling with residual charge, and limped toward the Medicae station, flanked by two imperial fists whose bolters never quite pointed at him, but never quite pointed away. Behind him, the courtyard smoldered, and the eastern wall gaped open like a wound that would need 100 workers and 1,000 hours to repair. He had saved lives, he knew that, had prevented a slaughter that would have cost the defense dearly. But in the silence of the imperial fists, in the cold efficiency with which they sealed the breach and categorized casualties and filed incident reports, he understood something fundamental. His war was not their war. His way of fighting, alone, improvised, trading injury for victory, was the antithesis of everything the 7th Legion had been built to exemplify. And for the first time since arriving on this burning world, Thor wondered if perhaps he truly was alone. The thought was interrupted by a new voice, rough and accented with something that sounded almost feral. That was the most gloriously stupid thing I have witnessed since Sanguinius decided to personally duel a bloodthirster on the Cathedral of Martyrs. Thor turned. The warrior approaching was Legionis Astartes, but his armor was crimson instead of gold, and his pauldron bore a winged blood drop that seemed to glisten even in the smoke-choked light. His helmet was mag-locked to his hip, revealing a face that was aristocratic and haunted in equal measure, with eyes that held too much red in the iris. "Brother Sergeant Asgaelon," the warrior said, offering a gauntlet in the warrior's greeting. "Blood Angels, First Company. I was on the wall when you called that lightning." A grin that showed too many teeth. It was beautiful, wasteful, tactically questionable, and absolutely beautiful. Thor clasped the offered forearm, and something in him unclenched slightly. Thor Odinson, of Asgard, which apparently means nothing here. "It means you are not afraid to bleed," Askelon said. "In this place, at this time, that makes you brother enough." The Mechanicum Sanctum beneath the palace was a cathedral to a god of cogs and current, and Magos Dominus Urzi Malevolus presided over it with the fevered dedication of a priest who had just glimpsed the face of the divine. Thor stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by a forest of scanning equipment that hummed and clicked and whispered in machine code, while 3 junior tech priests circled him like scavengers around a carcass. His hammer rested on an altar of black stone 15 meters away, isolated within a containment field that crackled with barely contained energy every time Mjolnir pulsed with its slow, patient heartbeat. "Fascinating," Malevolus breathed, his mechadendrites weaving complex patterns in the air as they transmitted data to cogitator banks that lined the walls. "The energy discharge you produced in the courtyard registered at 7.3 megawatts, sustained for 3.1 seconds. The human body, even an enhanced human body, cannot channel such power without catastrophic cellular breakdown. Yet your tissue samples show minimal necrosis. Accelerated healing factors, yes, but the underlying resistance to electrical trauma." His optics whirred, refocusing. "It suggests a physiological adaptation that predates known genecraft paradigms." "I am Asgardian," Thor said for the 4th time in an hour, his patience wearing thin. "We are built differently than humans, stronger, more durable, longer lived. I have told you this." "You have told me a designation," Malevolus corrected. "Asgardian. A proper noun that appears in no database, no archive, no fragmentary STC record spanning 12,000 years of human expansion." A servo arm extended, its needle tip drawing another blood sample from Thor's arm with clinical precision. Which suggests either a deliberate expunging from records, highly improbable given the Mechanicum's exhaustive archival protocols, or an origin point external to known human space. The Magos paused, and when he spoke again, there was something approaching wonder in his mechanical voice. You are alien, Odinson, not in the crude sense of Xenos morphology, but in the fundamental sense of biological and technological divergence from the human baseline. Thor's jaw tightened. I am not alien. I have fought beside humans across a dozen realms, bled with them, mourned them. Whatever differences exist between your kind and mine, they are not so vast that... Your hammer, Malevolus interrupted, gesturing toward the containment field. We have subjected it to every scanning protocol in the Martian canon. Material analysis returns contradictory results. Spectroscopy suggests a metallic lattice structure that shifts at the quantum level. Mass spectrometry indicates impossible density ratios. And the runes... His voice dropped to something approaching reverence. The inscriptions are not decorative, they are functional. Hyper-compressed data storage, encoded in a medium that may predate human written language. We have identified 17 distinct symbolic systems, 3 of which correlate with fragmentary records from the dark age of technology. He turned fully toward Thor, his robes rustling with the movement of hidden mechanisms. This weapon is not merely advanced, it is ancestral. It represents a technological lineage that either evolved parallel to humanity or diverged so far back in our mutual history that the branching point has been lost to time. A pause. Tell me, Odinson, how old is Asgard? Thor was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on Mjolnir. The hammer pulsed once, and he felt the familiar resonance in his chest like a second heartbeat. Old, he said finally. Old enough that the founders are myth even to us. Old enough that we have forgotten more than most civilizations ever learn. He met the Magos' compound gaze. My people did not arise from nothing. We were shaped, built perhaps by those who came before. The stories are unclear, but we have always known that we are inheritors of a legacy we can no longer fully comprehend. The old ones, Malevolus whispered, and there was hunger in it, or something like them, a precursor race with mastery over biology and physics that makes our own mechanicum look like children playing with fire. His mechadendrites twitched with agitation. If your Asgard represents a preserved fragment of that ancient technology, if your physiology is a working model of pre-human genetic engineering... He trailed off, calculations clearly consuming him. You want to dissect me, Thor said flatly. I want to understand you, Malevolus corrected. Dissection would be inefficient. You are more valuable as a functional system than as component parts. A servo arm gestured dismissively. Besides, Lord Dawn has made his position on your termination quite clear. You are a strategic asset. Damaging you without cause would be impolitic. How comforting, Thor muttered. The Magos tilted his head in what might have been the mechanical equivalent of a shrug. I speak only truth. The Omnissiah teaches that efficiency and honesty are synonymous. You are useful alive. Therefore, you remain alive. The logic is pure. A junior tech priest approached, bowing with the stiff formality of someone whose spine had been replaced with steel. Magos, the resonance scan of the artifact has completed. Results are anomalous. Malevolus moved to the data screen with the hungry speed of a predator scenting blood. Thor watched the Magos' optics flare brighter as he absorbed the information, watched mechadendrites type faster than human hands could follow, watched something like awe and horror war for dominance in those augmented features. Impossible, Malevolus breathed. The quantum signature is alive, not in the biological sense, in the informational sense. The weapon is processing data, making calculations, adjusting its own internal structure in response to external stimuli. He turned to Thor. How is it intelligent? Mjolnir is bound to me by enchantment, Thor said, the word sounding strange in Gothic. It chooses who may wield it. It returns when called. It understands in its way, not as you understand, not as I understand, but it knows its purpose. Enchantment, Malevolus repeated, and the skepticism was palpable. A colloquial term for technology you do not fully comprehend. Some form of psycho-reactive programming, perhaps, or a limited machine spirit far more sophisticated than anything in our current paradigm. His mechadendrites coiled and uncoiled with nervous energy. If we could decode the mechanism, replicate even a fraction of the bonding protocol, the strategic applications would be... The lights flickered. Every tech priest in the chamber froze. The hum of machinery, the constant background prayer of servitors and cogitators, stuttered and died for 3 full seconds before surging back with a whine of overtaxed systems. Malevolus's Vox grill crackled. "This is Sanctum 3. Report power fluctuation. All systems nominal on our end." The response came through layers of static. "Sanctum 3, be advised. Massive warp spike detected across all palace sectors. Multiple demon incursions in progress. Scrap code attack on Mechanicum networks. Stand by for..." The Vox died in a squeal of corrupted data. Thor was already moving toward Mjolnir. The containment field sparked as he approached, its machine spirit recognizing threat protocols, but he did not slow. His hand closed around the hammer's grip, and the field screamed before collapsing in a shower of sparks. Alarms wailed. Gun servitors swiveled toward him with mechanical precision. "Stand down," Malevolus barked, his command overriding their targeting protocols. To Thor, "You cannot leave. The sanctum is sealed under siege protocols. We are 40 meters underground with 3 bulkheads between us," and the first bulkhead exploded inward. What came through was not a demon. Not exactly. It had been a tech priest once, before something had gotten into the code, into the machine spirit, into the meat that remained beneath the steel. Now it was a fusion of metal and madness, mechadendrites ending in blades and cutting lasers, optics flickering with data corruption that looked too much like screaming faces. 2 more followed, then 5, then a dozen. A tide of corrupted mechanicum pouring into the sanctum with the shrieking binary of a choir gone insane. Malevolus's remaining organic hand made the sign of the cog. Scrap code manifestation, full quarantine protocols, purge by flame, and... A corrupted servo arm punched through his chest cavity, sparking and grasping, and the Magos Dominus went down in a spray of oil and blood that steamed where it hit the floor. Thor roared, wordless, primal, and threw himself into the tide. Mjolnir sang its own song, lightning and impact, crushing metal and shattering augmetics with each swing. A corrupted tech priest lunged at him with cutting lasers hot enough to boil steel, and Thor took the hit across his pauldron, felt the heat sear through even Asgardian defenses, then brought the hammer down on the thing's skull hard enough to crater the floor beneath them. The junior tech priests were screaming now, their hymns turned to panic as the corrupted swarm overwhelmed defensive protocols. Gun servitors fired into the mass, but for every corrupted unit that fell, 2 more poured through the shattered bulkhead. The sanctum was becoming an abattoir, flesh and machine dying in equal measure. Thor fought toward the data screens where Malevolus had fallen. The Magos was still alive, barely, his augmetics sparking, coolant leaking from ruptured systems. Thor grabbed him with one hand, hammer in the other, and began to fight his way toward the far wall where an emergency exit was marked in high Gothic script. "The data," Malevolus gasped through ruined Vox grills. "The scans, the quantum analysis, cannot fall to corruption." "Forget the data," Thor snarled, lightning arcing from his shoulders to fry a corrupted servitor that got too close. "We need to..." Malevolus's remaining functional mechadendrite jabbed a data spike into a nearby cogitator port. Uploading. to isolated archive, 7-7 beta. His optics flickered. If you survive, tell Lord Dawn, the weapon is older than the Imperium, older than humanity. Preserve it, at all costs. The Magos went limp. Thor did not have time to check if he was dead. The tide was closing in, the sanctum filling with corrupted machine flesh that moved with terrible purpose. He reached the emergency exit, slammed Mjolnir against the locking mechanism until it shattered, and threw himself into the darkness beyond as the sanctum collapsed into screaming static behind him. He ran through maintenance tunnels that had not seen light in decades, ran until his lungs burned and his ribs screamed, and the sounds of corruption faded to distant echoes. Only when he emerged into a storage bay 3 levels up did he allow himself to collapse against a support pillar, gasping, covered in oil and blood that was not entirely his own. His vox collar crackled to life. Captain Archimus's voice, clipped and urgent. All units. Palace-wide incursion in progress. Scrap code attack has compromised 30% of Mechanicum systems. Multiple demon manifestations across all defensive sectors. All assets report to rally points for immediate deployment. Thor looked down at Mjolnir. The hammer was scored and scorched, but it pulsed with steady, patient life. In the darkness, its runes glowed faintly, and he could swear they were forming words in a language he almost remembered. He stood, tested his weight, and began the long climb back to the surface where his new brothers were dying. Behind him, in the depths, something screamed in corrupted binary that sounded almost like laughter. Brother Sergeant Asgardian of the Blood Angels found Thor on the petitioner's wall 3 hours into the largest coordinated assault the siege had yet seen, and the first thing the angel said was, "You fight like you have a death wish." Thor barely heard him over the roar of bolter fire and the shriek of Neverborn tearing through reality 50 meters downslope. He was drenched in blood, some his, most not, and his armor bore scorch marks from a dozen near misses. Mjolnir hummed in his grip, its runes blazing white-hot as another surge of lightning arced down the wall to immolate a pack of lesser demons scrambling over the ramparts. "I fight to win," Thor shouted back, not looking away from the killing field below. "There is a difference." Asgardian moved to stand beside him, his bolt pistol barking measured shots into the tide. Around them, blood angels held the wall with the grim elegance of a legion that had made an art form of controlled violence. But Thor could see the cracks, the way Asgardian's trigger finger hesitated fractionally between shots, the tremor in his gun hand that had nothing to do with recoil, the way his eyes tracked the blood splatter on the walls with an intensity that went beyond tactical awareness. "You throw yourself at demons like a man trying to prove something," the angel continued, his voice tight. "You take hits you could avoid. You push deeper than any sane warrior would. I recognize the pattern, Odinson. I have watched my brothers succumb to it for 200 years. A pause as he maglocked his pistol and drew his combat blade, a beautiful thing etched with devotional script. "You are running from something, and eventually it will catch you." Thor slammed Mjolnir into the rampart, and the resulting shockwave sent 3 bloodletters tumbling back into the chasm beyond the wall. "Perhaps I am running," he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. "Or perhaps I simply understand that in wars like this, there is no such thing as caution, only temporary survival and eventual death. I choose to make my survival count for something." "Nobility," Asgardian said, and there was bitter understanding in the word. "The most dangerous lie we tell ourselves." He vaulted over the rampart, landed in a crouch 10 meters below, and his blade became a silver blur as it opened throats and severed limbs with the precision of a surgeon who had forgotten what healing looked like. Thor followed without thinking, Mjolnir leading the way down, and together they carved a wedge into the demon tide. The Blood Angel fought with a grace that was almost painful to watch, every movement economy and lethality, but Thor could see the cost. Could see how Asgardian's eyes lingered on every spray of blood, how his breathing quickened when ichor splashed across his crimson plate, how something behind his gaze grew hungrier with each kill. They fought back to back, the Angel's blade and the Asgardian's hammer, and for 3 minutes of eternity, they were perfect, unstoppable, a duet of destruction that pushed the demon tide back meter by bloody meter. Then Asgardian froze. A word-bearer's legionary had emerged from the demon press, his armor covered in blasphemous scripture that hurt to read, and he held a chainsword that wept blood from its spinning teeth. Behind him, 3 possessed marines shambled forward, their flesh warped into configurations that mocked the form they had once worn with pride. "Blood Angel," the word-bearer called, his voice a sermon of corruption. "I can smell your thirst from here. Your gene father's flaw, written into every cell. How long has it been since you fed? How long since you let yourself taste what you truly crave?" Asgardian's blade trembled. "I am my father's son. I am in control." "Control," the word-bearer laughed, a sound like bones breaking underwater. "You control nothing. The red thirst controls you. It whispers in every battle, promises relief in every death, and one day, perhaps today, you will finally listen." Thor saw it happening, saw Asgardian's pupils dilate, saw his jaw clench hard enough to crack teeth, saw the tremor spread from his hands to his whole body. The angel was fighting a war on 2 fronts, the demons before him and the demon within, and he was losing both. The word-bearer charged. Asgardian met him halfway, and what followed was not a duel. It was a feeding frenzy barely contained in Legiones Astartes' flesh. The Blood Angel's blade became a whirlwind, striking not for efficiency but for carnage, opening the word-bearer in a dozen places while his free hand clawed at the traitor's helm, tearing it away to reveal a scarred face twisted with religious ecstasy. Then Asgardian's teeth found the traitor's throat. Thor moved on instinct. He drove the hammer's haft between them, breaking the grapple, and the angel rounded on him with eyes gone completely red, lips pulled back from bloodied teeth in a snarl that was barely human. For one terrible second, Thor thought he would have to fight him. Thought he would have to kill a warrior who had shown him kindness in this place of none. "Brother," Thor said quietly, holding Asgardian's gaze, "you are not this. You are more than your thirst. I have seen you fight with honor. Do not let them take that from you." Asgardian shuddered, his whole body convulsing with the effort of control. When he spoke, his voice was razored glass. "You do not understand. You cannot. The thirst is not hunger. It is certainty. It tells me that blood is the only truth, that everything else is lies and weakness, and fighting it is like trying to hold back the tide with bare hands." "Then let me help you hold," Thor said. He reached out slowly, placed one hand on the angel's shoulder. "You are not alone in this. You do not have to bear it alone." Something in Asgardian's expression cracked. The red receded slightly from his eyes, replaced by something that might have been gratitude or might have been despair. "You offer brotherhood to a monster." "I offer brotherhood to a warrior fighting the hardest battle any of us can face," Thor corrected. "The battle against what we might become." He gestured toward the wall, where blood angels and imperial fists held the line together. "And I know something of that fight. I have been beast and god and something in between, and I have learned that what defines us is not the darkness we carry, but whether we let it devour us whole." A possessed marine lunged at them, its form a nightmarish fusion of Astartes and something that had never been human. Asgardian moved, his blade taking it in the chest, but the killing stroke was controlled now, precise. The frenzy had been leashed, if not defeated. "You are a fool, Odinson," Askelon said, as they retreated back toward the wall, covering each other's withdrawal. "A noble, stubborn fool who thinks honor matters more than survival." "Survival without honor is just a slower death," Thor replied. "I learned that the hard way, many times." They reached the ramparts as the demon tide finally broke, unable to sustain itself against the combined fire of 2 legions and a thunder-wielding stranger from beyond the stars. Bodies, material and immaterial, choked the approach. The wall held. The cost was 14 blood angels dead, 23 Imperial fists wounded, and 1 Asgardian who could barely stand. Askelon caught him as his legs finally gave out. "You need the apothecaries." "I need 5 minutes without something trying to kill me," Thor muttered. His ribs were broken again. He could feel the grinding when he breathed, and something hot was leaking down his side beneath the armor. "Is it always like this?" "No," Askelon said, and there was dark humor in it. "Sometimes it is worse." They sat together on the rampart, 2 warriors from different worlds bound by blood and battle, and watched the horizon burn. In the distance, the traitor fleet hung like a noose around Terra's throat, and the palace was a fortress of the damned where every dawn was a theft and every dusk a promise of horrors renewed. "Why do you do it?" Thor asked after a long silence. "Why fight so hard to hold on to your humanity when it would be easier to let the thirst take you, to become what the whispers promise?" Askelon was quiet for so long that Thor thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft as a knife through silk. "Because my gene-father is the most beautiful thing the Imperium has ever created, and I am his son. Because when Sanguinius looks at us, he sees not what we are, but what we could be. Because if I fall, if I give in, then I prove that beauty and nobility are lies, and all that remains is the beast." He turned to look at Thor, and his eyes were human again, exhausted but human. "And because I have brothers who remind me, when I forget, that the fight is worth the cost." Thor nodded slowly. In the distance, another bombardment began to fall, and the palace shook with the inevitability of a world whose time was running out. But here, on this wall, in this moment, 2 warriors sat and shared the silence of those who understand that some wars are fought not with weapons, but with the simple act of refusing to break. "Your hammer," Askelon said eventually, nodding toward Mjolnir. "You said it chooses who may wield it. What does it choose for?" Thor looked at the weapon that had been his companion for longer than most civilizations endured. "Worthiness," he said simply, though I am no longer certain I understand what that word means. "None of us are," Askelon replied. "But perhaps that is the point. Perhaps worthiness is not about certainty, but about continuing to strive even when we doubt." Thor smiled, grim but genuine. "You are a philosopher, Brother Sergeant. I am a blood angel," Askelon corrected, which means I have had centuries to contemplate beauty, death, and the thin line between glory and damnation. He stood, offered a hand to help Thor to his feet. "Come, the Medici Bay awaits, and if we are very fortunate, we may have 6 hours before the next assault." They descended the wall together, and if Thor leaned on Askelon more than pride would normally allow, neither warrior mentioned it. In the shadow of the siege, such small dignities mattered less than the simple fact of survival. But as they passed through the inner gate, Thor glanced back at the killing field they had just defended, and something cold settled in his chest. They had won. They had held. But how many more walls would they hold before there were no walls left? How many more brothers would fall before the mathematics of attrition rendered courage meaningless? And buried deeper, a question he did not want to examine. What would it cost him, in the end, to stand on a wall that was not his own and die for a cause he still did not fully understand? He pushed the thought away and followed Asgardian into the depths, where the Medici waited with their knives and their mercy. The revelation came through a vox burst at 0300 hours, when Thor was half asleep in the barracks, watching moisture condense on ceramite and thinking about how the palace smelled less like stone now and more like opened bodies. Rogel Dawn's voice cut through the darkness, cold and precise and carrying news that would rewrite everything Thor thought he understood about his arrival. All senior command staff report to the Praetorium immediately. Priority Alpha. This includes the Asgardian asset. Thor was on his feet before the message finished, muscle memory older than continents overriding fatigue. Around him, imperial fists rose in synchronized silence, the kind of obedience that came from breeding and conditioning, and 2 months of learning that questions wasted time better spent staying alive. He pulled on his armor. The Mechanicum's servants had repaired the worst of the scorching, and made his way through the labyrinth of tunnels that honeycombed the palace's depths. The Praetorium was a war room built from stone and spite, its walls covered in tactical displays showing the siege's inexorable mathematics, red tide of traitors marking every advance, blue dots representing defenders that diminished day by day, and in the center, a map of something else entirely, a warp signature analysis that made Thor's breath catch. Rogel Dawn stood before the displays, his massive frame silhouetted against the light. Around him gathered the command staff, Captain Archimus, stern as judgment, Tribune Morovan of the Custodian Guard, his expression unreadable behind his helmet, Brother Sergeant Asgardian, whose presence marked the Blood Angels' increasingly formal integration into the defense, and others, officers whose names Thor had learned in Blood and Fire, warriors whose gene fathers were gods or tyrants, depending on which side of the war they had chosen. 2 hours ago, Dawn began without preamble. Our astropathic choir detected a psychic emanation originating from the warp gate in the northern approach. He gestured, and the tactical display shifted, zooming to show a specific location. The emanation carried a single repeating message in High Gothic. It took our best linguists 30 minutes to decode it, because the syntax is archaic, pre-heresy by perhaps 1,000 years. But the meaning is clear enough. He paused, letting the weight of what he was about to say settle. The message reads, "To the Thunderer who fell through the Bifrost Scar. We have sealed your passage home. The realm bridge breaks. Asgard falls. If you wish to see your kinfolk again, you must open the wound you made. The ritual requires 3 components: a god-bound weapon, a sacrifice of royal blood, and the death of something the Imperium holds dear. Choose swiftly. The gate will not remain open long." Every head in the room turned toward Thor. He felt the weight of their attention like a physical force, felt the calculation happening in minds that had been trained to assess threats and assets with mathematical precision. For a long moment, he could not speak, could not process the ramifications of what he had just heard. "It is a trick," Tribune Morovan said flatly. "A demon's gambit designed to turn the asset against the palace. We should execute him immediately and seal the northern approach with Mechanicum protocols." "Perhaps," Dawn said, his eyes never leaving Thor. But the message used specific references to Asgardian cosmology, the Bifrost, the concept of the realm bridge. Details that our cogitators have found no record of in any accessible database. The demon did not extrapolate. It knew. The Praetorian stepped forward, which suggests either that it possesses knowledge of your homeworld, or that someone, something with access to your memories is speaking through the warp. Thor's vision had gone narrow and strange. He could barely hear Asgardian breathing beside him, barely register the way Archimus's hand had rested on his bolter with the casual ease of someone who had already decided to kill him if he moved wrong. "My people cannot reach across the veil," Thor heard himself say. His voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. The Bifrost was severed, the bridge between worlds broken before I arrived here. Even if... He stopped, swallowed. Even if they still lived, they could not send a message through the warp. Our magic does not work in that way. Your magic, as you call it, appears to function quite well here, Dawn observed. Your lightning ignites in our air. Your hammer cracks our stone. Your blood heals by mechanisms our medici cannot explain. He gestured, and one of his officers brought forward a data slate. This is the transcript of your initial interrogation. You stated that you did not know why Mjolnir brought you here, that the hammer's will supersedes your own in questions of transit. That is true, Thor said, but doubt had crept into his voice like poison through a wound. Then consider the possibility, Dawn said carefully, that your hammer was sent specifically to this place, at this moment, by forces you do not understand. Not as rescue, but as recruitment. The words hung in the air like a grenade with its pin pulled. You are suggesting, Thor said slowly, that I was manipulated, that my arrival here was not chance, but design. I am suggesting, Dawn replied, that in a war spanning galaxies, precious few things are random. Your appearance on the throne world during the siege of Terra, armed with a weapon that our greatest tech priests cannot comprehend, speaking of a realm that predates human spacefaring, these are not coincidences. These are facts that demand explanation. And the message through the warp? Thor's hands had clenched into fists. What explanation do you have for that? A test, Morhavan said, or a trap. Or both. A demon's game designed to force you into a choice that serves chaos regardless of what you decide. The Tribune's spear shifted slightly. If you attempt to open the Bifrost, the ritual will likely tear a gateway large enough for chaos to pour through. If you refuse, the demons will have succeeded in sowing doubt and discord among the defenders. Either way, Terra falls. Unless, Asgardian said quietly, and every gaze shifted to the Blood Angel, we are being offered a genuine choice, not by demons, but by forces that still oppose chaos. The message spoke of your kinfolk, of a homeworld in peril. If Asgard truly exists, truly stands at risk of annihilation, then Odinson faces a genuine moral calculus. The lives of his people weighed against the lives of an Imperium that is not his own. Which would make him a liability, Morhavan said flatly. Or a man, Asgardian replied, and there was steel in it, which is something we have in short supply in this place of monsters and demigods. Dawn raised a hand, silencing the debate. Odinson, you will answer me with complete honesty. If you believed Asgard could be saved, if you believed your people could be brought back from destruction, would you abandon this siege to attempt it? Thor opened his mouth, closed it. The question was a trap that had no good answer. To say yes was to confirm that his loyalty was conditional. To say no was to deny his own nature, to betray everything his people had taught him about duty and family, and the bonds that transcended death itself. I do not know, he said finally, and the admission felt like tearing something vital out of his chest. If I believed that my people could be saved through no other means, then, yes, I would attempt it. The Bifrost has been my only path home for longer than this war has raged. The hope of return is something I have held onto through battles I thought would be my last. He turned to face Dawn directly. But I do not believe the message. Because what you have said is true. Nothing in this war is random, and a message carried through the warp, speaking of my homeworld, offering me salvation. That is precisely the kind of bait that demons use. They speak truth wrapped in lies. They offer what we most desire, knowing that the pursuit of it will destroy us. Yet you do not know for certain, Dawn said. No, Thor admitted. I do not. And that uncertainty will haunt me for the rest of my life. however long that proves to be. The Praetorian studied him for several long seconds, and Thor could see the calculations happening behind those grey eyes, weighing worthiness, assessing loyalty, testing character against crisis. Finally, Dawn nodded slowly. "Bring the Asgardian to the northern approach," he commanded. "We will investigate this anomaly directly. Tribune Moravan, marshal the custodian guard for containment protocols. Brother Sergeant Azkaelon, you will accompany us." He paused. "And Odinson, if you attempt anything that suggests betrayal, I will personally ensure that your death is neither swift nor painless. Do you understand?" "Perfectly, Lord Dawn," Thor said. They descended into the depths of the palace, following passages that had not been disturbed since the Great Crusade. The warp gate lay beneath the palace's northern foundations, a massive construct of stone and something that resembled metal, but behaved like congealed reality. It had been sealed since the war began, painted with ward signs and covered in protective scriptures that had begun to fray at the edges. And now, it was screaming. Not with a sound, but with the frequency that lived beneath sound, that made Thor's teeth ache and his blood feel like it was trying to escape through his skin. The gate was opening. A crack had formed along its center, and through it poured something that was not quite light and not quite darkness, something that hurt to perceive directly. "There," Dawn said, pointing. "Approximately half a meter of structural degradation since our last inspection 6 hours ago. At current rate of expansion, the seal will fail completely within 18 hours. Unless," Tribune Moravan said, "something accelerates the process. A god-bound weapon, perhaps, wielded by someone desperate enough to gamble on damnation." Thor felt all eyes turn toward him, felt the weight of expectation and suspicion pressing down like a physical force. His hand moved almost of its own volition toward Mjolnir, and he forced it back down. "I could open it," he said quietly. The ritual described in the message, a god-bound weapon, a sacrifice of royal blood, something the Imperium holds dear. I have the weapon. My blood is royal by Asgardian measure. And this palace," he gestured broadly, "it is the seat of the Emperor you revere. If I used Mjolnir to destroy the Sanctum Imperialis itself, the ritual would be complete. The Bifrost would open, and I could go home." "Why tell us this?" Archimus asked, his bolter twitching fractionally toward ready status. "Why not simply act?" "Because," Thor said, turning to face them all, "I am not who I was when I arrived in your burning sky. I came here alone, a stranger in a war I did not understand, but I have fought beside you, bled beside you, and I have learned what you have taught me through every moment of this siege, that some things matter more than survival, that loyalty, once freely given, is not easily recanted." He looked at Azkaelon. "You offered me brotherhood when I was a threat, when every rational calculation suggested I should be executed. You saw in me a warrior trying to hold onto his humanity, and you helped me hold. Then to Dawn, and you gave me purpose, Lord Praetorian, a place to stand, a wall to defend. You treated me as an asset, yes, but an asset with agency and choice. You did not demand loyalty. You made conditions for it to be earned." His gaze swept the assembled command staff. "I could open the Bifrost and damn this world in the process, but if I did, I would prove that I am not the warrior I have tried to become. I would prove that I am nothing but a god playing at being a man, willing to betray any cause in service of my own preservation." He drew Mjolnir, and every weapon in the chamber came to bear, but he did not move to the gate. Instead, he drove the hammer into the stone at Dawn's feet. "I stake my claim here," Thor said, "on this world, in this siege, in this war. If Asgard falls, it falls. But I will not abandon you to save something that may already be dust and memory. That is my choice, and I will live or die by it." For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The gate continued to scream, its tear widening fractionally with each passing second, and Thor stood before Rogel Dawn, warrior before warrior, and waited for judgment. The Praetorian's expression was unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone making a decision that would echo through centuries. "Seal the gate," Dawn commanded. "Full Mechanicum protocols. Blackstone if we have it. Null chambers if not. And I want this Bifrost scar contained behind enough wards that not even a god could break through." He turned to Thor. "Your hammer will remain here as the sealing focus. It will bind the gate shut and hold it sealed for as long as it remains." "My lord," Morhavan protested, "if we separate the Asgardian from his weapon, he will be more effective," Dawn interrupted. "Without Mjolnir, he cannot attempt the ritual. Without his weapon, he will fight harder, knowing his only escape has been sealed." The Praetorian's gaze met Thor's. "Unless you object to this arrangement." Thor looked at his hammer, the weapon he had carried for longer than most civilizations endured, the anchor that had always been his connection to home and hope, and the possibility of return. "I consent," he said, and meant it. As they walked back through the tunnels, leaving Mjolnir behind in the depths bound to a seal that might never break, Thor felt something shift inside him. The last chain connecting him to Asgard had been severed. The possibility of return had been foreclosed not by force, but by his own choice. And somehow, that was liberating. The warp truth came to Thor in dreams, which should have been his first warning that nothing about it was real. He was standing on a bridge made of light suspended over an abyss that went down forever. Below, he could see Asgard, not the golden halls he remembered, but something twisted and burning. Its towers collapsed into themselves, its people scattered like ashes on a poisoned wind. And standing at the bridge's far end was a figure he recognized with the kind of bone-deep certainty that only comes from blood and memory. His father, Odin Allfather, king of Asgard, the god who had fathered him and shaped him and sent him into the world to be his hammer against the dark. Except Odin was wrong. His eye, the one he had sacrificed for wisdom, had been replaced with something that swirled with colors that had no names. His armor bore marks that looked almost like the script Thor had seen on the corrupted tech priests in the Mechanicum's sanctum. And when he spoke, his voice came from too many directions at once, as though multiple entities were sharing the same throat. "My son," the thing that wore Odin's shape said, "you have been chosen for a great purpose. The Imperium you serve is a lie built on corpses. The Emperor you defend is a tyrant who sacrificed his own sons to perpetuate his vision of universal domination. And you, God-born, worthy, powerful, you are wasted here, throwing your strength against walls that should have fallen long ago." "This is not real," Thor said, but there was doubt in it. The dream had the visceral weight of truth. He could feel the wind rising from that abyss, smell the burning of his homeland. "Demons cannot reach me through Mjolnir's absence. The connection between us is too strong." "We do not reach through the hammer," the thing replied. It moved closer, and Thor saw that what he had taken for robes was actually flowing warp substance, constantly shifting between states of matter and energy. "We reach through you, through the doubts you carry, through the memories of a home that may never be seen again, through the terrible knowledge that everything you fight for could be ashes by now, and you would never know." The dream Asgard burned brighter. In the flames, Thor thought he saw figures, his kinfolk, the warriors he had trained with, the women who had borne the next generation of Asgardians, all dying, all crying out his name. "Stop," Thor whispered. "We show you only truth," the corrupted Odin said. "The pathways that might have been, should have been, could still be, if you break the seal you made, if you open the Bifrost and return. Chaos does not lie about its nature. It is change, possibility, the destruction of rigid hierarchies that bind and crush. Serve us, and you can save Asgard. Serve the Imperium, and watch everything you love perish in a war that will rage for 10,000 years. Thor's fist clenched. In the dream, Mjolnir materialized in his grip. Not the real hammer, bound in stone far below the palace, but an echo of it, a phantom made from the structure of his own will. He raised it toward the thing wearing his father's face. "I will not be swayed by phantoms and false truths," Thor said, and his voice was steady. "I have fought demons, I have learned their nature, and I know that what you offer is not salvation but damnation dressed in the language of hope." "Even if we speak truth?" the demon asked. Its form was fracturing now, the illusion of Odin's shape breaking apart to reveal something made from angles that should not exist in three-dimensional space. "Even if Asgard truly burns, even if your people are truly dying, would you not break 1,000 oaths to save them?" "Yes," Thor said, and the honesty of it shook him. "If I believed you, if I had any certainty that what you showed me was real and not simply your approximation of my deepest desires twisted into a weapon against my resolve." The demon laughed, and the sound was like reality tearing. "Then we are done here. You are worthless to us, Thunderer. You choose your wall. You choose your lie. And when it all falls, and it will fall, as all things fall, you will remember this moment and know that your pride cost you everything." Thor woke in darkness, gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs like something trying to escape. He was in the barracks, in his assigned bunk, surrounded by the soft sounds of sleeping warriors and the ever-present hum of palace machinery struggling to compensate for damage that accumulated faster than repairs could address it. But the echo of the dream remained. The image of burning Asgard, the plea in his father's voice, or the demon's approximation of it. The terrible, unanswerable question, "How do you know?" He rose, knowing sleep would not come again, pulled on minimal gear, and made his way to the wall, where the night watch was a skeleton crew of Imperial fists running on stimulant stim and desperation. They recognized him, the Asgardian asset, the god without his god hammer, and nodded him through without question. He found Asgardian on the Colossi Gate approach, standing alone, staring out at the siege lines where the traitor forces held their positions like a noose drawn tight, but not yet cinched. The Blood Angel's shoulders were rigid with tension, and his armor bore fresh scorch marks that suggested he had seen recent action. "You dreamed," Asgardian said without preamble. It was not a question. "How did you—" "Because I too have dreamed," the angel interrupted, turning to face him. "Every night since we came to this wall, Sanguinius calls to me through the darkness, tells me that I am failing him, that the red thirst I have suppressed for so long is his true purpose, and I should embrace it rather than deny it." Asgardian's voice was hollow. "The dreams are so vivid, Odinson, so detailed and real, and every morning I wake wondering if perhaps the demon speaks truth instead of lies." Thor moved to stand beside him, looking out at the burning horizon. "The demon that came to me wore my father's face. It showed me Asgard burning, told me that I could save it if I betrayed this place." "And would you?" Asgardian asked. "If you truly believed Asgard was in peril, if you knew beyond doubt that breaking your oath would save it, would you do it?" Thor took a long time answering. "I do not know," he finally said. "And that uncertainty is perhaps the most damning thing I could admit." "Welcome to the nature of choice," Asgardian said bitterly. "All of us here stand on walls we did not build, fighting wars we did not start, and we do so knowing that at any moment the demons could tempt us toward betrayal with truths so profound We could not refuse them. He gestured toward the siege lines. My brothers are dying down there, dying because of the flaw in our blood that Sanguinius passed on without meaning to. I can hear them calling from the warp, begging to be released from the pain, and the only way to grant that mercy is to let the red thirst consume me completely and join them in damnation. But you do not, Thor said. But I do not, Asgardian agreed, because I have learned that sometimes the bravest thing a warrior can do is resist not through strength, but through simple, stubborn refusal to break. To say no to every temptation, no matter how appealing, because the alternative, betraying everyone who depends on you, is a death more final than any blade can achieve. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the night sky flicker with distant explosions and the dying embers of starships burning through atmosphere. Thunder rumbled in the distance, not from Mjolnir, which had never been heard outside its wielder's grip, but from the storm that perpetually wreathed the palace, as though Terra itself was raging against the corruption that sought to consume it. Your father, Asgardian said eventually, the real one, not the demon's approximation. What was he like? Thor considered the question carefully. Odin was wisdom and war, cunning and strength all braided together. He sacrificed his eye to know the future, his arm to win a war, his life to understand the runes that bind reality together. He was not kind, he was not gentle, but he was noble in his way, committed to preserving the 9 realms against the darkness that sought to devour them. And he would want you to preserve this world? Asgardian pressed. I do not know, Thor admitted. Odin would want me to do what serves the greater good, but he would not judge me for choosing my own people's survival over a world I had no connection to. Then perhaps your father is not the one guiding you now, Asgardian suggested. Perhaps you have become something more than an extension of his will. Perhaps you are Thunderer now, not merely Odin's son. Thor turned to look at the Blood Angel, and something in Asgardian's expression suggested that this advice cost him something vital to offer. You are saying I should forget Asgard, forget the possibility of home. I am saying, Asgardian replied carefully, that home is not always a place. Sometimes it is a cause. Sometimes it is the warriors standing beside you on a wall at the end of the world. And sometimes home is something you build rather than something you return to. A new vox burst came through, urgent but controlled. All senior command staff report to the Praetorium. Priority Alpha, new strategic development. Asgardian and Thor exchanged glances. The Blood Angel activated his vox response immediately, acknowledging the summons. They descended into the palace's depths together, and when they reached the war room, they found it in controlled chaos. The tactical displays showed something new. A secondary force had emerged from the warp approximately 50 kilometers from the palace walls. Not a traitor reinforcement, but something other. The energy signatures were unlike anything in the Imperium's archives. The vessel configuration suggested technology that predated human spacefaring by millennia. And scrawled across the top of the data slate in high Gothic script was a single phrase: Asgardian battle fleet, designation uncertain, origin unable to classify. Every head in the room turned toward Thor. It appears, Rogaldorn said quietly, that your people are not as fallen as the demons suggested. The question now is whether they come as allies or another obstacle to overcome. Thor stared at the tactical data, his mind reeling. Asgard was not destroyed. His people had not perished in whatever catastrophe had severed the Bifrost. They had somehow found their way here, to Terra, to this burning siege world in a distant corner of a galaxy they had no business visiting. And now they were approaching the palace. What do the readings tell us? Thor asked, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions roiling beneath the surface. Are they hostile? Unknown, Dawn replied. Sensors indicate weapons' hot status, but that could simply be standard protocols for approaching a war zone. The Praetorian paused. We are attempting to establish Vox contact, but their communication systems do not match any known frequency. They are adapting. It will take time. Time we may not have, Tribune Moravan observed. If they are traitors in different skin or demons wearing the guise of this Asgardian asset's people, then we defend the palace as we have been defending it, Dawn said flatly, by holding the wall until reinforcements arrive or enemies are destroyed. He turned to Thor. Your people, if they are truly Asgardian, will recognize you. If they attempt to communicate, you will serve as intermediary. But understand this. If they prove to be enemies or demons in disguise, I will kill you before I allow them to enter the palace. Understood? Understood, Lord Dawn, Thor said. As they filed out of the Praetorium to prepare for what might be either salvation or annihilation, Thor caught Asgar-Ellen's eye. The Blood Angel's expression held understanding, but no answers. Because neither of them knew what the arrival of Asgard's fleet truly meant. Whether it was rescue or a new variety of damnation, whether the warriors aboard those ships were Thor's brothers come to save him, or something wearing their faces. In the darkness of the palace's depths, far below in the sealed chamber where Mjolnir waited, the hammer began to resonate with a frequency that matched something in the approaching fleet. And for the first time since the siege began, Thor felt something that might have been hope, or might have been the prelude to the greatest betrayal of all. The Bifrost scar tore open like a wound that had never properly healed. Thor felt it the moment it happened, a wrenching sensation that started in his chest and radiated outward through every nerve, as though something fundamental to his existence had been severed and then reconnected in the wrong configuration. Alarms shrieked across the palace's communication network. Seismic sensors went haywire, and somewhere in the depths, Mjolnir began to sing a frequency that made reality itself protest. The seal is failing. Tribune Moravan's voice came through the Vox, tight with controlled panic. Blackstone wards are degrading. The null chamber is experiencing reality cascade failures. Something is pushing from the other side. Thor was already moving, his body responding to instinct older than thought. He ran through the palace's corridors with Asgar-Ellen at his heels, both warriors moving with the desperate speed of those who understand that some catastrophes cannot be outrun, but must be met and confronted head-on. Behind them, Imperial fists scrambled to respond to the emergency, bolters loading with practiced efficiency. They reached the sealed chamber to find it in chaos. The gate was splitting open in a way that defied physics, its edges fraying into strands of pure warp stuff that writhed with pseudo-sentience. The null chamber's protective fields were collapsing in cascading failures, each shutdown triggering the next in an accelerating sequence of destruction. And standing in the center of the chamber, bathed in light that came from no earthly source, was Mjolnir. The hammer was floating 3 meters above the ground, rotating slowly, its runes blazing white-hot as they poured energy into the seal in a desperate attempt to hold it closed. But something was pushing back from the other side, something vast and golden and burning with the particular fury of a god who had been separated from their children for too long. Thor, a voice called through the widening rift, and Thor's heart stopped. He knew that voice, had heard it speak commands that shaped civilizations, wisdom that guided him through centuries of war and loss, and the endless struggle against the dark. Thor, son of Odin, the pathway stands open. Return to us. Asgard needs its thunderer. Father! Thor called, uncertainty and desperate hope warring in his voice. But Asgar-Ellen grabbed his arm, holding him back. No, the Blood Angel said flatly. Look closer. The voice carries harmonic undertones consistent with warp possession. Your father is not there, Odinson, or rather he is there, but something else speaks through him. Thor squinted, forcing himself to look at the figure in the rift with more than just his heart. And yes, he could see it now, the telltale shimmer of corruption overlaying the golden form. The figure wore Odin's appearance, but underneath that shape, something else moved with Odin's limbs, something that had come from the abyss between worlds. A trick, Thor whispered. A new one, Asgardian agreed. Your father sent a message, or the demons approximated one well enough to lure your fleet here. And now they have learned that your presence, your connection to Asgard through blood and will, is enough to force the Bifrost open. Thor's hands had clenched into fists. Then I sealed the gate for nothing. My sacrifice meant nothing. The seal is breaking anyway, and soon enough. The demons will have an open pathway into the palace, Rogaldorn finished, stepping into the chamber with Captain Archimus and a squad of Huskarls at his back. The Praetorian took in the situation with a single comprehensive glance. Tribune, collapse the northern approaches. Seal every tunnel with cyclonic charges. We will not lose the palace to warp incursion. The northern approach is still occupied, Morovan protested. 200 warriors holding the line against. Then they are already lost, Dorn said flatly. Prioritize the inner sanctum. The Emperor must be protected. The Praetorian turned to Thor. Your hammer. It is trying to hold the seal closed, using its own power to compensate for the gate's degradation. But it cannot hold indefinitely. The strain will destroy it. Then we must close the gate from this side, Thor said, understanding crystallizing. Seal it permanently. Use the palace's own power, the Emperor's will, whatever force is strong enough to... The ritual requires a sacrifice, Dorn interrupted. His grey eyes met Thor's. A life freely given, offered with full knowledge of what it means. A death that will bind the gate shut and hold it sealed for 10,000 years or more. The silence that followed was absolute. I will do it, Thor said, stepping forward. The gate is open because of me. My connection to Asgard is what the demons leverage. If I... No, Asgalon said. The Blood Angel moved between Thor and Dorn, his blade drawn but held at rest. If the Thunderer dies sealing a gate on another world, who will stand on the walls when the next assault comes? Who will be the light that holds back the darkness for the warriors bleeding their lives into this siege? Brother Sergeant, Dorn said quietly, and there was warning in the title. You are questioning a Primarch's command. I am stating a tactical fact, Asgardian replied. Odinson's continued survival increases our chances of holding the palace by an estimated 12%. His death would be a net loss we cannot sustain. He paused. But I can serve. He walked forward before anyone could stop him, before the weight of command could pin him to indecision. Walked directly toward the rift where the corrupted Odin shape waited, toward the Bifrost scar that was tearing wider with each passing second. No. Thor lunged forward, but Dorn's massive hand closed around his shoulder, holding him in place with strength that could not be overcome. Let him choose, the Praetorian said quietly. As you chose, as we all choose, here at the end of everything. Asgalon stood at the threshold of the rift, his blade held before him in salute. I am Asgalon, warrior of the Blood Angels, son of Sanguinius, born into the darkness and devoted to the light. I offer myself as the price of this seal. I give my life, freely and with full knowledge, so that this world and these warriors may endure. The corrupted Odin shape shrieked, a sound of rage and hunger and terrible disappointment. No, it wailed. We need the god blood. We need the Thunderer's sacrifice to truly break through, to tear the pathway wide enough for the full demon prince. Asgalon drove his blade into his own heart. It was done cleanly, without hesitation or doubt. The Blood Angel collapsed, his blood, far too red, carrying within it the particular taint of his gene-father's flaw, spreading across the sealed chamber's floor in patterns that were almost like runes themselves. And as Askellen's life fled his body, something changed in the warp rift. The Bifrost scar began to close, not by external pressure but by the fundamental weight of Askellen's sacrifice. The Blood Angel's death was not merely the ending of a life, it was a binding, a conscious choice made with absolute conviction, anchoring itself into the fabric of reality and sealing shut what had been torn open. The corrupted Odin shape wailed as its pathway collapsed. "This is not over, Thunderer. Your people still burn, Asgard still falls, and when the end comes, you will remember this moment and know that your pride cost you everything." The rift sealed with a sound like thunder speaking in reverse. The Bifrost scar was gone. The gate was closed. The Null Chamber's fields, no longer straining against external pressure, began to normalize. And Askelon lay on the stone floor, his life already beginning its transition from the material world to whatever waited beyond for a warrior who died in service of something greater than himself. Thor wrenched free of Dawn's grip and ran to the Blood Angel's side, dropping to his knees. Askelon's eyes were still open, still aware, still burning with the terrible clarity of someone who had just made the only choice that mattered. "Brother," Thor said, and the word was broken glass in his throat. "Why? You did not have to." "Yes," Askelon whispered, his voice fading like a song that had already been sung. "I did, because the red thirst will always hunt me, because in my blood runs a hunger that can never be sated, because I was always going to lose myself in this war, and I could choose whether that loss meant nothing or meant everything." His hand, still warm, reached up and gripped Thor's. "Thank you," the Blood Angel said, "for reminding me what it meant to choose, to stand on a wall, to refuse the easy path even when it offered everything." Askelon. "Tell Sanguinius," the angel continued, his voice barely a whisper now, "that I understood, that his burden was not a curse but a gift, because it showed me how to truly love, how to choose honor over hunger, how to—" He stopped. His eyes lost their focus. His hand went limp in Thor's grip. Askelon of the Blood Angels, who had fought with grace and dignity through 200 years of war, who had stood beside Thor in darkness and shown him the meaning of brotherhood, was gone. Thor held him there in the darkness of the sealed chamber, and for the first time since arriving on Terra, he wept. Not for Asgard, not for home, not for the god blood that had been spilled. He wept for the warrior beside him, for the friend who had seen him clearly and accepted him anyway, for the life that had burned so bright and was now extinguished. "Attend to the body," Dawn said quietly, and there was something in the Praetorian's voice that suggested even a god could bleed. "The Blood Angels will want to honor their fallen, and summon the Mechanicum. We must reinforce the seal further. No more rifts, no more chances for damnation to find a foothold." As Archimus and the Huskarls entered the chamber, as Mechanicum servitors began the work of sealing and warding what had become a tomb, Thor gently closed Askelon's eyes and spoke a prayer in Asgardian, a hymn for those who had fallen far from home. Because that was what Askelon had been in the end. A warrior far from home, defending walls that were not his own, bleeding for people who would never know his name. A god in his own way, bound by oath and honor, and the terrible certainty that some choices, once made, could never be unmade. When Thor finally stood to leave the chamber, when he finally released Askelon's body to the rites that would follow, he felt something fundamental shift within himself. The last threads connecting him to Asgard had been cut not by his own hand, but by a gift of sacrifice he could never repay. He was Thor Odinson no longer. He was Thunderer of Terra, god of the palace walls, a warrior who had chosen his people and would spend whatever remained of his life ensuring that choice meant something. And somewhere in the depths, in a sealed chamber that would be remembered long after this war ended, Mjolnir pulsed with patient, eternal life, waiting for the day when the god who had sacrificed everything would find the strength to wield it again. The corruption came not through the gate, but through Thor himself. He felt it starting 3 hours after Asgardian's death, a creeping sensation that began in his chest and spread outward like frost forming on glass. The warp energy that had poured through the Bifrost scar before it closed had marked him, touched him with something that was not quite possession, but not quite external either. It lived in his blood now, a passenger that whispered in frequencies only the god-touched could hear. At first it was almost seductive. The whispers promised power beyond what even Asgardian physiology could provide. They offered visions of Asgardian alive again, of fallen warriors rising to stand once more on the walls, of a world where death was negotiable and loss could be reversed through the simple act of surrendering to the warp's infinite possibilities. Thor refused each offer with iron will, but the cost of refusal was mounting. His hands had begun to shake. His vision occasionally fractured into spectra that human eyes were never meant to perceive. And when he looked in a reflective surface, he sometimes saw something else looking back, a shadow that wore his face but moved with subtly wrong kinematics. "You are being consumed," Rogel Dawn said flatly, studying him in the Praetorium with eyes that missed nothing. They had convened an emergency war council, and Thor had been ordered to attend despite his protests that he should be on the walls, bleeding where it mattered. The warp taint from the Bifrost incursion has marked you. Within 72 hours, you will be a full demon possession or a corpse, possibly both. "Then we treat it," Thor said, his voice rougher than it had been, as though something was learning to speak through his throat. "The Mechanicum has purification protocols. The Emperor's sanctified warriors have rituals. There must be—" "There is nothing," Tribune Moravan said, and there was something almost apologetic in the custodian's tone. "We have attempted basic purification on soldiers exposed to minor warp taint. Success rate below 5%, and those survivors are rarely sane enough to be useful. Full possession-level corruption such as you carry responds only to extreme measures." "Execution," Captain Archimus said quietly. "A clean death and immediate incineration of the body to prevent resurrection or possession spread." Thor's hands clenched into fists. Around the Praetorium, officers shifted uncomfortably. They had fought beside this god, had seen him stand against demons and hold walls against impossible odds. The calculus of his termination was not clean mathematics. It was the murder of a warrior who had earned the right to die in battle, not on an execution block. "There is an alternative," Dawn said, and every head turned toward him. "The Emperor maintains a chamber beneath the Sanctum Imperialis, a place of meditation and power where he communes with something. I do not claim to understand what. The priests call it the Throne of Binding. Legend suggests it was built during the Dark Age of technology, or perhaps before. Its purpose is ostensibly to allow the Master of Mankind to maintain his will across the vastness of the Imperium through psychic means." He paused. "But it has other functions. One of them is the purification of the warp corrupted. The process is not gentle. Many subjects do not survive it, but those who do emerge cleansed, though changed. You are suggesting I go into the Sanctum Imperialis," Thor said slowly. "The one place in this palace I was explicitly forbidden from approaching, the chamber where your Emperor sits." "I am stating a fact," Dawn replied. "What you choose to do with that fact is your own decision, but decide quickly. The corruption is accelerating. Every hour you delay reduces the probability of successful purification. Thor felt the weight of every eye in the chamber, felt the calculation happening in those trained, tactical minds. A god corrupted by chaos was more dangerous than a god dead, but a god purified, bound to the Emperor's will, strengthened by survival of the throne's purification. That was something else entirely. That was a weapon that could not be turned against the palace, because its very survival would be bound to the Emperor's power. "I will do it," Thor said, and felt the corruption within him rage at the decision, clawing at his sanity, promising horrors if he resisted. "But I need something first. I need to return to the sealed chamber where Asgardian died." "Denied," Morhavan said immediately. "Your contamination cannot be allowed near the seal. If the corruption reaches Mjolnir, it will not," Thor interrupted. "Because I am not going there to touch the hammer or the seal. I am going there to say goodbye to a brother I failed to save." Something in his tone silenced further objection. Dawn nodded slowly. "Captain Archimus will accompany you. You have 1 hour." The sealed chamber was exactly as they had left it. Asgardian's body lay in state, prepared by blood angel servants in the ritual of their legion. His armor had been cleaned of blood, arranged around him in the traditional pose of a warrior at rest. His blade lay across his chest, and his helmet bore a wreath of whatever flowers could still be found growing in the palace's hydroponic gardens, pale white blooms that seemed to glow in the darkness. Thor knelt beside his fallen brother, and the corruption within him pressed against his consciousness like a predator testing the bars of its cage. He could feel the demon offering him temptations. "It could bring Asgardian back," it whispered. All it would take was a simple surrender, a moment of weakness where Thor allowed the warp to flow through him unchecked. One moment, and then Asgardian would open his eyes, would rise, would stand on the walls once more. "I know your lies," Thor said aloud, speaking to the corruption and to the ghost of his brother both. "I know what you are and what you offer, and I refuse." He reached out and took Asgardian's cold hand in his own. "I cannot bring you back," Thor continued. "I cannot undo what you chose. But I can make certain that your choice meant something. I will carry what you taught me, the meaning of standing firm, even when everything screams that you should break. I will carry you in memory until the end of all things." Beneath the corruption, beneath the warp-touched madness trying to claw its way into his control, Thor felt something shift. A moment of clarity, a window opening where the demon's grip loosened fractionally. In that moment, he understood what Asgardian had understood when he drove the blade into his own heart. There were choices that mattered more than survival, oaths that meant more than the self. And some warriors were measured not by how long they lived, but by what their death made possible. "Thank you, brother," Thor whispered, "for showing me how to choose." He rose, and Archimus was there with a gesture that indicated they needed to move. The hour was nearly complete, and the corruption was accelerating, burning through Thor's physiology with increasing hunger. His vision was fragmenting now. His heartbeat had taken on a rhythm that did not quite match human physiology. The demon within was growing impatient, confident in its approaching victory. They descended deeper into the palace, deeper than Thor had ever gone, past levels that looked like they had been sealed since the dark age of technology, past chambers that hummed with energies that made his god-born senses scream in protest. The air grew thicker, more resistant, as though reality itself was becoming something you had to push through rather than move through. Finally, they reached the Sanctum Imperialis. The doors were gold and inscribed with runes so complex that Thor's mind could barely pass their geometry. Archimus placed his hand on a scanner, and the doors swung open to reveal a chamber that was impossible to perceive all at once. The mind tried to encompass it and failed, reorienting itself constantly as it attempted to understand the space. And at the center of that space sat the Emperor of Mankind. Thor had seen depictions, heard descriptions from warriors who had stood in the Golden Throne's presence, but no preparation could have readied him for the reality of it. The Emperor was not a man. He was a principle given form, a will so vast that it made even a god feel small. His body was ancient beyond measure, preserved by a technology that predated human civilization by eons, and the power radiating from him was a pressure that threatened to compress Thor's consciousness into nothing. "Come, Thunderer." A voice that was not a voice spoke directly into Thor's mind. "You carry contamination that would destroy a lesser being, but you are God-touched. You have the strength to survive the binding. Surrender yourself to the throne, and we will burn away the corruption while binding you to our will." Thor wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain some shred of autonomy, some fragment of self that was not subsumed into the Emperor's vast, all-consuming consciousness. But the corruption was too strong now. It was burning through the last of his defenses, consuming his identity piece by piece. Within hours, there would be nothing left but a demon wearing Thor's face. He walked toward the throne. The purification was not gentle. It was agony rendered in frequencies that had no names, pain so complete and overwhelming that Thor's consciousness fragmented into 1,000,000 shards, each one experiencing its own particular torture. The warp corruption was burned away, but the burning took everything Thor was and remade it in fire and anguish. Through the haze of suffering, he felt himself being bound, felt his will being woven into the Emperor's vast consciousness like a thread in an infinite tapestry, felt the loss of autonomy, the surrender of choice, the subsuming of his identity into something far greater and far colder. And at the moment when he thought the binding would consume him entirely, Mjolnir's voice reached him from the depths below. The hammer sang, and in that singing was the memory of Asgardian's choice, the blood sacrifice, the warrior who had given everything so that others could stand, the meaning that transcended self and death, and all the false divisions that kept gods and men apart. Thor seized that memory like a drowning man seizing a lifeline. He wove it into his own consciousness, made it a part of his identity, let Asgardian's sacrifice become the anchor that held him separate from the Emperor's will. The binding shifted, changed. Instead of a complete subjugation, it became something more like an alliance. The Emperor could feel Thor's determination, could sense the warrior's absolute refusal to be completely consumed. And impossibly, something that might have been respect moved through the vast consciousness. The purification ended. Thor collapsed, gasping, his body trembling with the effort of simply remaining alive. The warp corruption was gone, burned away completely. But something remained, a connection to the Emperor's will. A thread of awareness that would allow the Master of Mankind to perceive what Thor perceived, to know what Thor knew. It was not freedom, but it was not slavery either. It was something in between, a synthesis of will that was unique and unsettling and surprisingly balanced. "The throne accepts you," the Emperor's consciousness said through Thor's own mind. "You are bound now, Thunderbearer. Your will is your own. But your purpose is ours. Go, defend the walls, stand against the darkness, and know that when the end comes, you will stand with us." Thor staggered to his feet. Archimus was there, ready to catch him if he fell. The Huskarl captain's expression suggested that he could perceive something of what had transpired, though the details remained beyond mortal comprehension. "Did you survive?" Archimus asked. "I survived," Thor said, his voice strange to his own ears, still his own, but carrying harmonics that suggested something vast, listening behind every word. But I am changed. We all are, I think. This whole palace, this whole war, it changes everyone who stands upon it. We become something more or something less, but we never remain what we were. They climbed back toward the surface, back toward the walls where warriors were dying in increments, bleeding out their lives in service of a palace and an emperor and an ideal that most of them would never fully understand. And with each step, Thor could feel Mjolnir calling to him from the depths. The hammer was ready. The god was ready. And the final phase of the siege was about to begin. Sanguinius came to the walls at dawn, and the sky split open with his coming. The angel Primarch descended through the smoke and ash like a judgment made flesh, his massive wings unfurled, his armor blazing with the particular radiance that only the Emperor's chosen could truly embody. Behind him came the remnants of the Blood Angels, a legion reduced to a few thousand warriors from the hundreds of thousands who had begun the siege, but each one burning with the desperate fury of those who know they are witnessing their final stand. Thor watched from his position on the Colossia Gate, where he and 100 Imperial fists held the line against a fresh demon incursion. The Angels' arrival sent ripples through both sides of the war, traitor forces momentarily faltering, as though the sheer presence of Sanguinius was enough to make even chaos reconsider its certainties. Sanguinius landed on the rampart not 5 meters from where Thor stood. Up close, the angel was almost too perfect to perceive. His beauty was a weapon in itself, a reminder of what the Emperor had intended humanity to become before the fall and the corruption and the long descent into the Grimdark age. His eyes were golden and terrible, carrying within them the weight of visions and prophecies and the knowledge of his own inevitable doom. "Thunderer," Sanguinius said, and his voice carried harmonics that made reality itself listen. "I have heard of you from my blood angels. Asgardian spoke of you in his final moments, and his words reached me even as I fought in the lower palace." The angel Primarch studied Thor with an intensity that stripped away pretense. "You are bound to the Emperor now. I can feel it in the way you stand, the way reality bends slightly around your presence. You have been remade." "I have been changed," Thor corrected. "I am not certain remade is the accurate term." "Change and remake are siblings," Sanguinius replied. He raised his massive sword, a weapon that looked more like a lance, inscribed with prayers and edicts in a dozen languages, and pointed it toward the traitor lines. "But we have little time for philosophy. The Warmaster sends his final assault. The tide of his rage breaks against these walls even now, and this will be the moment that decides all." The angel turned to look directly at Thor, and there was something almost like apology in those golden eyes. "Before the end comes, I must know. Did my sons serve with honor? Did they hold the line as blood angels should?" Thor thought of Asgardian, thought of the warrior who had stood beside him through days of endless combat, who had taught him the meaning of choice, who had sacrificed everything so that a gate could be sealed and a world could endure. "Asgardian held the line," Thor said. "More than that, he held the line within, against the hunger that your blood gifts him. He was brave and noble, and at the end, he was at peace with what he chose." Something shifted in Sanguinius's expression, a moment of profound grief and profound pride warring for dominance. "Then my sons did not fail me. That is worth more than all the victories this war has yet seen." The bombardment began before either could speak further. Traitor ordnance rained down on the palace from the fleet above, opening new breaches in walls that had been repaired and repaired until the stone itself seemed tired of holding. At the same time, a fresh wave of demons poured forward, and mixed among them were the traitor legions, world eaters with their frothing madness, Death Guard with their shambling resilience, word-bearers chanting prayers to gods that had never deserved worship. And leading them all came Angron, the Red Angel, the Slave Emperor, the Primarch who had become something less than human and more than demon. He was tremendous in his fury, 12 feet of meat and rage, and the particular agony of someone who had chosen damnation over the possibility of redemption. Nails of iron pierced his skull, driven through bone into the very seat of consciousness, and they wept a black ichor that burned where it touched stone. His two massive axes, weapons the size of land raiders, carved through defenders with casual brutality, and his roar was a frequency that made mortal eardrums rupture and gene-enhanced physiology protest. "Sanguinius!" Angron bellowed across the chaos of the killing field. "Brother, come and face me. Let us settle what the Emperor's grand design could never settle. Which of us is worthy of the legacy he left us?" Sanguinius moved to meet his fallen brother, and what followed was a duel that transcended mere combat. The two Primarchs clashed at the rampart's peak, their weapons creating explosions of light and force that threw combatants from the walls like leaves in a hurricane. Sanguinius fought with grace and purpose, every move calculated to drive toward victory while minimizing collateral damage. Angron fought with pure, undirected rage, a berserker's dance that treated his own life with the same disregard as his enemies. And for a moment, it seemed that Sanguinius might actually triumph. His superior tactical sense began to overcome Angron's raw fury. The Angel Primarch's blade found openings, exploited weaknesses, drove his corrupted brother slowly backward. Then Angron laughed, a sound like slaughterhouses given voice, and the nails in his skull flared with hellish light. For just a moment, Thor saw it, saw what was truly happening. The nails were not a curse, or rather they were, but they were also anchors. Anchors that tied Angron to something vast and terrible in the warp. Something that wore the guise of a god, but was really just the accumulated rage and suffering of every being who had ever died in agony. And Angron was opening a pathway to it. "No," Thor said, not thinking, just acting. He ran toward the duel, toward the rapidly expanding warp rift that Angron was tearing open through sheer force of will and corruption. Behind him, the battle continued, traitors and defenders locked in their final eternal struggle, but none of that mattered anymore. He reached Mjolnir's calling point, and the hammer answered. The sealed chamber far beneath the palace exploded. The Blackstone wards shattered. The Null Chamber's protective fields gave way, and Mjolnir, bound and sealed and held dormant for so long that it had nearly become a myth, tore free. It came up through the palace like a comet, leaving a trail of lightning in its wake, shattering stone and destroying whatever stood in its path. It reached Thor's hand, moving at speeds that should have torn his arm from its socket. But God-born physiology held firm, and in the moment he grasped the hammer, everything changed. The corruption that had been burned away returned, but not as possession. This time it came as power, channeled through Mjolnir, transformed into something that was part warp lightning and part Asgardian stormcraft. Thor felt himself expanding, his consciousness spreading across the palace walls, feeling every warrior who stood and fought, every defender clinging to sanity and purpose, every moment of sacrifice and determination. He was no longer just Thor. He was Thunderer of the Walls, God of the Defenders, the storm that had chosen a side in a war between empires. "Angron!" Thor roared, and his voice carried across the killing field with the force of thunder. "Step back from that rift, or I will close it with you still halfway through." The corrupted Primarch turned, his mutilated face twisting into something that might have been a smile, or might have been a rictus of agony. "The Asgardian god," he said, his voice layered with harmonics that suggested multiple entities speaking through a single throat. "Come to play hero on a wall that has already fallen. I have learned, Thor replied, raising Mjolnir. That heroes are just warriors who refuse to break at the moment when breaking becomes inevitable. He threw the hammer. The impact between God Weapon and Warp Rift was cataclysmic. Reality screamed. The very fabric of space convulsed. And Mjolnir, moving with the force of a god's entire will behind it, drove straight into the center of the rift and sealed it from inside. The hammer lodged in the warp wound like a stopper in a bottle. Its runes blazed with white-hot fury as it poured energy into the closing, burning away demon matter and warp stuff with absolute conviction. The rift collapsed inward, collapsing down toward Mjolnir, trying to consume the hammer and failing. Angron shrieked as his pathway closed, as his plan to bring the full might of his patron god into the material world was cut off by a weapon that had been forged before humanity learned to walk upright. He lunged toward the collapsing rift, trying to force it wider, but Sanguinius was there, driving him back with sword and will alike. "It is finished, brother," the angel said quietly. "You have lost. Accept that grace now, and we can end this with mercy." "Mercy!" Angron spat the word like a curse. "You dare speak to me of mercy when you stand unmarked by the nails, unburdened by the hunger that devours my every moment. I am beyond mercy. I am beyond hope. I am the rage of a God-given form, and when I fall, I will take everything with me." His words cut off as the last of the rift sealed completely. Mjolnir disappeared into the closing wound, pulled into the warp alongside Angron, locked together in a struggle that would continue long after the material world had forgotten this moment. The Red Angel Primarch was gone. For a moment, perfect silence fell across the palace walls. Traitors and defenders alike stopped fighting, stopped moving, stopped breathing in the face of what they had just witnessed. A Primarch was no longer. A weapon that had defined ages was sealed away in the warp. And the siege, the endless grinding siege that had consumed months and lives and hope, had reached a point of fundamental change. Then the surviving traitors began to retreat, not in panic, in order. The World Eaters fell back to their positions. The Death Guard staggered toward the lower palace. The word-bearers chanted prayers of withdrawal that suggested they had planned for this contingency all along. The tide of corruption and rage that had been pressing against the palace's walls began to ebb, pulling back like the ocean before a tsunami, leaving bodies and devastation in its wake. Thor collapsed to his knees as the power of the hammer's departure faded from him. He was just a man again. A god in form, yes, but without the weapon that had defined his purpose. Without Mjolnir, he was incomplete in a way he had not fully understood until the moment of loss. Sanguinius helped him to his feet, his golden eyes showing something that might have been gratitude, or might have been the particular understanding that comes from watching another warrior sacrifice everything they were in service of a cause that was not their own. "You are diminished now," the Angel Primarch said. "Without your hammer, you are merely strong instead of godlike." "Perhaps," Thor replied, "but I am not alone, and that makes all the difference." He looked around at the walls, at the Imperial fists who had bled for every meter of stone, at the Blood Angels who had stood against the hunger within and refused to break, at the Custodian Guard who had never wavered in their duty, at all the warriors who had chosen to hold rather than flee. They had not won, not completely. The siege continued. The traitor fleet still hung in orbit. The war was far from over. But they had held, and in that holding they had proven something that the Warmaster had not expected, that loyalty, once freely chosen, could not be broken by demon or death or the promise of false salvation. Sanguinius raised his sword, and the surviving defenders raised theirs in echo. And across the blood-soaked walls of the palace, a sound rose that was part cheer and part prayer, and part the simple acknowledgement of warriors who had stared into the abyss and refused to blink. The siege of Terra continued. But now, it continued against defenders who had already beaten back hell itself. The World Eaters came at midnight, and they came screaming. They were the last true believers in Angron's vision, the warriors who had not retreated with the main traitor force, but instead dug in for a final suicidal assault. Their armor was painted in blood that had never been properly cleaned, decorated with skulls and scripture in a language that hurt to read. At their head came Karn the Betrayer, the Warmaster's executioner, a warrior so steeped in carnage that his very presence seemed to make the laws of physics protest. Thor stood on the Eternity Gate alongside Rogel Dawn and 100 Imperial fists, watching the tide rise in the pre-dawn darkness. The Praetorian was silent, his expression unreadable, his storm's teeth charged and ready. Next to him, Thor felt the absence of Mjolnir like a missing limb, a phantom weight that would never quite leave him. "They have nowhere left to go," Captain Archimus observed, his vox grill steady despite the obvious casualties the gate had sustained. "The Warmaster's retreat has cut them off from the main force. They are choosing to die here rather than face the shame of withdrawal. Then we will oblige them," Dorn said flatly. He raised his hand, and vox signals cascaded through the defenders' network. "All units, prepare for close quarters engagement. They come seeking death. We will provide it with efficiency." Karn struck the gate first, his chain axe, a weapon that defied reason with its sheer size and mass, meeting the reinforced ceramite with an impact that rang like a funeral bell. The gate buckled, cracked. The structural integrity warning screamed across every tactical display, and behind Karn, 200 World Eaters poured through the breach like blood through a wound. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter rendered in both directions. The World Eaters fought with an abandon that transcended warfare. Each strike carried the weight of centuries of rage, each death a celebration rather than a tragedy. They did not care about tactics or positioning or the basic principles of defensive warfare. They only cared about reaching the palace's heart, about dying in a final act of faith to their corrupted god, about taking as many defenders with them as possible into whatever hell awaited on the other side of death. Thor found himself fighting beside Dawn, the two of them moving in a synchronization that spoke to months of bleeding together on these walls. The Praetorian fought with his characteristic precision, every strike calculated, every movement economical, every blow aimed with the knowledge that ammunition and energy were finite resources that had to be conserved. Thor fought differently. Without Mjolnir, he was forced to rely on his god-born physiology and the training of centuries. He took hits he could have avoided, traded injury for momentum, used his body as a weapon in ways that would have gotten a mortal killed 100 times over. His fists cracked bones, his feet shattered kneecaps, his teeth, gene-enhanced and sharp, tore open arteries when opening distance meant death. "You fight like you have nothing left to lose," Dorn observed between breaths, ducking under a chainsword that was meant to take his head. "I do not have nothing left to lose," Thor replied, slamming his palm into a World Eater's chest hard enough to rupture organs. "I have everything to lose, but I have learned that sometimes the way to protect what matters is to stop calculating the cost and simply act." Karn loomed out of the melee like a nightmare given flesh. The betrayer was massive even by Primarch standards, his armor layered with the blood of 1,000 warriors, his eyes the particular vacant madness of someone who had surrendered completely to the hunger. His chain axe sang as it moved, and everything it touched ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. "Dawn," the betrayer said, and there was something almost conversational in his tone despite the screaming violence around them. "The Emperor's noble son, still standing, still believing that rigid order can hold back the tide of glorious, beautiful chaos." "I am still standing," Dawn agreed, Because order is not rigid, it is adaptive. It bends but does not break, and it has weathered worse than you, Khan. They clashed, and the impact sent warriors flying from the rampart like leaves in a hurricane. Dawn was smaller than Khan, less massive, but he moved with a precision and economy that made every strike count double. The betrayer fought with raw, overwhelming power, each strike capable of shattering stone, each movement designed to overwhelm through sheer force. Thor moved to support the Praetorian, but found his path blocked by 3 World Eaters who had separated themselves from the main fighting. They were younger than Khan, their armor less layered with trophies of conquest, but they burned with the particular fervor of true believers. They came at him in perfect formation, chain swords humming with anticipation. Thor dodged the first strike, let the second whistle past his ear close enough to feel the wind, then drove his fist through the third warrior's helm. The legionary went down, his skull crater too severe even for post-human physiology to repair in the time frame that mattered. The other 2 came again, pressing him back toward the gate's edge. They were coordinated, trained, experienced, and they were also exhausted in ways that Thor, gifted with Asgardian stamina, was not. He played defensive, let them commit to their attacks, waited for the inevitable moment when their formations would break. It came when the sun crested the horizon. Light flooded the gate, and in that light, Thor saw something that changed everything. Behind the World Eaters, visible through the breach in the gate, the traitor fleet was breaking formation. Ships that had held their positions for weeks were suddenly pulling back, their weapons going cold, their engines flaring as they began the long acceleration necessary to achieve escape velocity. The Warmaster was retreating. "Hold!" Dawn's voice cut through the noise of battle with absolute authority. "Imperial fists, hold the line. Do not pursue, let them flee." The fighting began to slow as both sides realized what was happening. The traitor forces, suddenly ordered to withdraw, started falling back in disciplined fashion. The World Eaters, the last true believers, looked confused, their opportunity to die in glorious combat being denied them by the simple fact that their war had already been lost. Khan himself paused, turning to look at the retreating fleet, as though it were a betrayal of everything he had sacrificed to believe in. "No," the betrayer said, and there was something like anguish in his voice. "No, we were meant to hold. We were meant to burn this entire world and bring the blood god's blessing down upon everything." A Vox signal cut him off. The Warmaster's voice, distorted by distance and corruption but still carrying the weight of command. "All traitor forces, immediate tactical withdrawal. The Emperor's defenders have proven more resilient than anticipated. We consolidate and reform. Victory will come, but not today." Khan stared at the sky where the traitor ships were disappearing into the upper atmosphere. For a moment, Thor thought the betrayer might simply stand there and scream his rage into the void. Instead, Khan raised his chain axe one final time and looked directly at Rogel Dawn. "This is not over, Praetorian," the World Eater said. His voice was eerily calm now, all the madness and fury burned away by the simple fact of defeat. "The Warmaster still holds Terra. The war continues. And when next we meet, there will be no walls, no reinforcements, no lucky god to seal away our salvation. There will only be warriors and the blood they bleed. Then we will see you soon," Dawn replied, and there was something almost like respect in the Primarch's gaze. "And we will stand." Khan turned and walked back through the breach in the gate. Behind him, the surviving World Eaters followed in disciplined formation, not fleeing but conducting a fighting withdrawal that spoke to the particular pride of warriors who refused to break even in defeat. They moved toward the lower palace, toward positions deeper in the war-torn city, toward wherever their Warmaster was consolidating his forces for what everyone understood would be the final phase of the siege. When the last of them had withdrawn, When the silence of sudden absence settled over the Eternity Gate, Thor finally allowed himself to sit down. His body was a catalogue of injuries, fractured ribs, lacerations that ran deep enough to expose bone in places, burns from close-quarters bolter discharge. He should have been dead. By any reasonable medical calculus, he should have expired hours ago. But he was Asgardian, and Asgardians were built for survival in ways that most mortal species could not comprehend. Dawn approached him, and the Praetorian Primarch actually extended a gauntlet to help him to his feet. It was a gesture loaded with meaning, a recognition of shared struggle, of warriors who had bled together and survived together. "The Warmaster retreats," Dawn said, "but the siege continues. He consolidates his forces, prepares for a final assault. We have perhaps 2 days before the next wave begins." The Praetorian paused, "And in those 2 days we must decide what comes next." "What do you mean?" Thor asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Sanguinius has already begun descending to the lower levels. The custodian guard prepares for a counter-assault. The Emperor stirs in the throne, and I can feel his will moving through the palace like lightning." Dawn's grey eyes held something that might have been resignation or might have been grim determination. "We are going to assault the Warmaster directly. We are going to take the war to him rather than continue to defend passively. And we are going to make him bleed for every meter of ground he has taken." "I will stand with you," Thor said immediately. "I know you will," Dawn replied, "but I need you to understand what that means. Without your hammer, you are vulnerable in ways you have not been vulnerable since arriving on Terra. The battle ahead will demand everything: your strength, your will, your willingness to die for warriors who are not your people, and a cause that was never yours to begin with." Thor thought of Asgardian, thought of the warrior who had shown him that some choices transcended blood and birth and all the false divisions that separated the peoples of the universe. Thought of the Bifrost scar that had been sealed by sacrifice, of the gate that remained closed, not because it could not be opened, but because to open it would betray everything that had been paid for its sealing. "I am already dead," Thor said simply. "I died the moment I chose to seal the Bifrost rather than return home. Everything after that has been borrowed time, paid for in blood that was not my own, and duty that was not my birthright." He met Dawn's gaze. "So I will stand with you, Lord Praetorian. I will bleed on your walls. And if the end comes, I will face it knowing that my sacrifice meant something." Dawn nodded slowly. "Then rest. Recover what strength you can. In 2 days, we descend into the lower palace, and we bring the war to the Warmaster's throne." As Thor moved toward the Medici station, as he passed through corridors that had been transformed into monuments to sacrifice and determination, he felt the weight of what was coming settle onto his shoulders like a mantle. The lower palace was a death trap, a maze of tunnels and chambers where demons nested and traitor forces held fortified positions. And somewhere in those depths, the Warmaster waited, confident in his victory, certain that he had already won. But he had not counted on a god who had learned to be a man, had not factored in a Praetorian who would hold until the last stone crumbled, had not understood that sometimes the greatest victories came not from overwhelming force, but from the simple, unbreakable refusal to surrender. 2 days remained until the final assault, 2 days to rest, to recover, to prepare for a descent into hell itself. And Thor, the thunderer of Terra, the god who had chosen a wall over a throne, would spend those days sharpening himself into a weapon worthy of the sacrifice that had bought these final, precious moments of breathing room. The lower palace was a necropolis of ambition and fury. Thor descended with Rogel Dawn and 1,000 warriors, imperial fists who had hardened into something beyond human through months of siege, custodian guard whose armor bore the scars of gods and demons both, blood angels who moved with the particular grace of those who had learned to walk the razor's edge between sanctity and damnation. They moved through tunnels that had never been meant for warfare, past chambers where the Emperor's great works hummed with energies that predated human civilization. And above them, pressing down like a physical weight, was the Warmaster's presence. Horus was still human in form, but only barely. The corruption that had claimed him had rewritten his physiology in ways that made even Sanguinius seem like a rough draft by comparison. Where he walked, reality bent. Where he spoke, demons listened. He was the Warmaster no longer. He was a vessel, a conduit, a focal point through which the powers of chaos poured into the material world. The first assault came in the chamber of the Astronomicon, a vast underground cathedral where the Emperor's signal was amplified to reach across the stars. Traitor forces had fortified it, turning its sacred geometry into killing fields, and they held it with the desperate ferocity of warriors who knew this was their last stand. Kharn was there, waiting for them, his chain axe still hungry, his eyes still burning with the madness that no retreat could diminish. But there was something different about him now. The unthinking rage had been tempered by defeat, sharpened into something more focused and terrible. "Dawn," the betrayer called as the Praetorian entered the chamber. "I knew you would come. I knew you could not resist the pull of this war, the chance to face the Warmaster and discover whether your rigid certainty could hold against the infinite flexibility of chaos." Kharn gestured, and the traitor forces moved to intercept the incoming defenders. "Let us settle this question with blood." What followed was a battle that would echo through centuries, the last great clash of the siege, where loyalist and traitor legions threw everything into one final exchange of violence. The custodian guard carved through traitor defenses with absolute precision, their weapons singing songs of extermination. The Imperial fists held formation under Dawn's commands, advancing meter by meter despite casualty rates that should have broken any conventional force. The Blood Angels moved like poetry written in blood, their grace and fury perfectly balanced. And Thor fought without armor, without weapons beyond his own God-given physiology, bleeding his way through the traitor tide with the kind of desperate determination that spoke to a warrior with nothing left to lose. A possessed marine came at him, something that had once been human, twisted by warp corruption into a mockery of its former self. Thor grabbed it by the throat, felt the corruption trying to poison him through his skin, and simply squeezed until something inside it broke. The warrior collapsed, its form beginning to dissolve as the warp stuff that animated it lost cohesion. More came, and more. Each one was harder to kill than the last, because chaos learned from its defeats. Each successive wave of corruption was more insidious, more perfectly designed to exploit the particular weaknesses of the defenders it faced. But Thor and Dawn and Sanguinius and the warriors who stood with them refused to break. They held the line, advanced, pressed deeper into the traitor positions. And slowly, meter by bloody meter, they began to wrest control of the chamber. Kharn fought Dawn directly, and it was a duel that transcended mere combat. The betrayer was trying to prove something, that even without Angron, without the Warmaster's direct presence, he could match the Praetorian's cold precision through raw, overwhelming force. Dawn was trying to prove something different, that discipline and training and the refusal to surrender could overcome even the corrupted strength of a legendary warrior. In the end, it was not strength or skill that decided it. It was will. Dawn fought knowing he would die if necessary. Fought knowing that his sons were depending on him, fought knowing that this was the last stand, the final moment where everything hung in perfect balance. And that absolute certainty, that willingness to accept death in service of duty, gave him an edge that no amount of warp enhancement could overcome. Khan fell to his knees, his armor scored and cracked, blood, far too dark, tainted with corruption, streaming from a dozen wounds. For a moment, Thor thought the betrayer might simply surrender, might accept defeat with the grace of a warrior who had finally met his match. Instead, Khan laughed, a sound like slaughterhouses giving voice. "You have won the chamber," the World Eater said, his voice thick and wet. "But the Warmaster awaits below, and he is not bound by the limitations of flesh and strategy. He is chaos incarnate, and against him all your discipline, all your loyalty, all your petty certainties will crumble like ash." Dawn raised his storm's teeth to execute the betrayer, but something made him hesitate. Perhaps it was respect for a worthy opponent. Perhaps it was the recognition that they were both warriors caught in a war neither had truly chosen. Perhaps it was simply the knowledge that one death, more or less, would not change the calculations anymore. "Rest, Khan," the Praetorian said quietly. "You have earned that much." The betrayer nodded slowly, as though accepting a benediction from an old friend. He closed his eyes, and his body began to relax, not into sleep, but into something deeper. The corruption that animated him was already beginning to consume what remained of his mortal frame, drawing it back into the warp. Within hours, there would be nothing left but a memory and a blood stain. The traitor forces broke after Khan's fall. Without their legendary warrior's presence, their certainty collapsed. They retreated toward the lower levels, collapsing tunnel entrances behind them, preparing for the final defense. But before the loyalists could pursue, the entire chamber began to shake. A crack opened in the stone floor, and from it poured a light so bright that it was almost impossible to perceive. And from that light stepped the Warmaster. Horus was magnificent and terrible. His armor was woven from something that was part metal and part demon flesh, inscribed with runes in languages that predated human speech. His face was recognizable as the noble features he had worn during the Great Crusade, but overlaid with something else, a presence so vast and alien that even looking at him directly threatened to break the mind. "Rogel Dawn," the Warmaster said, and his voice carried layers that human ears were not meant to process. "My brother, my greatest opponent. At last we stand face to face, and one of us will make a choice that echoes through eternity." "You have lost," Dawn replied, his voice steady despite standing before a being that had transcended humanity. "Your retreat was an admission of that. The palace holds. Your forces are scattered, and you have nothing left but the hope that we will hesitate long enough for you to gather your strength." "I have lost battles," Horus corrected, and he smiled, an expression that suggested human facial musculature was never meant to shape itself into such configurations. "But the war is far from over. Chaos is infinite. Infinite patience, infinite resources, infinite variants of strategy that you cannot possibly conceive." He gestured, and the chamber began to fill with demon matter, with warp stuff given temporary form. "I offer you a choice, brother. Surrender. Yield the palace. Bend the knee to the powers that now animate my will, and I will grant you immortality, a place at my side as I reshape the galaxy in the image of true freedom, true chaos, true reality as it was always meant to be." Thor felt it then, the moment when Dawn's absolute certainty wavered, just for an instant, just for a breath. Because what Horus was offering was not merely power or survival, but a kind of understanding that no mortal mind was equipped to comprehend. The promise that all the wars, all the suffering, all the sacrifice might somehow be redeemed by surrendering to something greater than self. It was the perfect temptation, the one that no warrior could fully resist. But Dawn was not just any warrior. "No," the Praetorian said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute refusal. You offer me false understanding wrapped in the language of revelation. You offer me corruption dressed as enlightenment. And you offer me a lie dressed as salvation." He raised Storm's teeth and fired directly at the Warmaster's heart. The bolt struck true, punching through armor and demon flesh alike. Horus staggered, and for just a moment, his human form flickered, revealing something underneath that was barely contained within the boundaries of three-dimensional space. "You dare!" the Warmaster shrieked, and his form began to expand, to grow, to become something so vast that the lower palace seemed suddenly small and fragile. "I dare," Dawn replied, "because that is what duty requires." What happened next defied narrative. The Warmaster and the Praetorian clashed in a way that transcended mere physical combat. It was a battle of will, of certainty against seduction, of the absolute refusal to break against the infinite possibility of corruption. Sanguinius and the Custodian Guard fought alongside Dawn, but their weapons could barely touch what Horus had become. And Thor, God-born, hammer-wielder, warrior of Asgard, found himself fighting something he had never encountered before. Not a creature, not a being, but an idea made manifest. The idea of chaos and infinite change, and the seductive beauty of surrendering control. It beat him down, broke him, scattered his consciousness across multiple states simultaneously. For a terrible moment, Thor existed in all possible positions at once, experiencing all possible deaths simultaneously, all possible failures manifested in the same instant. But then, a pulse of blue-white energy from far below, a resonance that cut through the chaos like a beacon through fog. Mjolnir, still sealed in the warp, still bound to the rift, still singing its defiance. The hammer's call reached Thor through layers of corruption and demon matter and impossible geometry. And in that call, Thor heard not his own will, but the will of every warrior who had bled on these walls. He heard Asgardian's sacrifice. He heard the Imperial fists who had held until they could not hold any longer. He heard the blood angels who had fought their own hunger and won. He heard the custodians who had never wavered. He heard Dawn's absolute certainty. Thor screamed, a sound that was part prayer, part defiance, part the primal rage of a god rediscovering his purpose. And in that scream he found his identity again, not as Odin's son, not as a god, not as an outsider to this war, as Thor Thunderer of Terra, as a warrior who had chosen his wall and would not abandon it. He drove his fist directly into the heart of Horus's corruption, and for just a moment, reality contracted. The infinite became finite, the chaos became comprehensible, and Dawn's blade found the opening. The Warmaster fell. Not destroyed, corruption did not die easily, but wounded, diminished, forced to retreat into the deeper levels where his power remained absolute. And in that retreat, the loyalist forces pushed forward, deeper into the palace, closer to the throne itself. The final phase of the siege had begun. The final stand came where all things must eventually come to end, at the throne of binding, in the presence of the Emperor himself. The chamber was smaller than Thor had expected, given its legendary significance. The stone was old, so impossibly old that it seemed to predate not just humanity, but the concept of human civilization itself. And seated upon that throne was the Master of Terra, the God Emperor of mankind, the being who had unified his species and set them upon a path of conquest and glory and slow, inevitable decline. He was dying. That was the first shock. The Emperor, the immortal, the being who commanded the loyalty of billions, was visibly failing. His body, preserved by technology that defied comprehension, was nonetheless wearing down. Wires and tubes connected to him in configurations that suggested he required constant intervention, simply to remain alive. And his eyes, when they opened to regard the warriors who had just fought their way into his presence, held a weight of exhaustion that suggested he had been enduring this existence far longer than any being was meant to. But his mind was still sharp, still absolute, still capable of understanding the full scope of the war and what it meant. "Rogel Dawn," the Emperor said, his voice like stone speaking, "you have held. Against odds that should have crushed you, against temptations that should have broken you, against the full might of a Primarch turned against me, you have held." "I have done only what duty required," Dorn replied, and he knelt, a gesture of submission that spoke volumes about the hierarchy that still bound the Praetorian to his master. "You have done more than duty," the Emperor corrected. His gaze swept across the assembled warriors, Sanguinius standing with his wings half unfurled, the custodian guard in perfect formation, the blood angels and imperial fists who had bled their way to this moment. "All of you have done more than duty. You have proven that loyalty, freely chosen and willingly defended, is stronger than the infinite promises of chaos." The Emperor's eyes found Thor, and the god felt reality compress around him. It was not painful exactly. It was the sensation of being truly seen by something vast and alien and operating on timescales that human comprehension could barely touch. "And you, Thunderer of Asgard," the Emperor said, "you came to us as an outsider, a god playing at being a warrior, and you have become something more. You have become human in the truest sense, not bound by flesh or birth, but by choice, by the simple, absolute refusal to break when breaking seemed inevitable." Thor felt something shift in his chest, not physical, but fundamental. The binding that had been placed on him in this very chamber began to change, becoming less a shackle and more an anchor. The Emperor was remaking the oath that bound him, transforming it from domination into alliance. "I offer you a choice," the Emperor continued. "You may return to whatever remains of your people. The Bifrost is sealed, but it is not permanent. Given time and sufficient will, it could be reopened. You could reclaim your throne, rebuild your kingdom, return to the existence you knew before the storm brought you here." Every warrior in the chamber went still. Even Dorn's expression remained unreadable, but his posture shifted fractionally, not toward or away, but into a neutral stance that suggested no interference regardless of what Thor chose. "Or," the Emperor said, "you could remain. You could stand as the guardian of the walls you have chosen to defend. You could be the thunder that keeps the darkness at bay. You could be a god not of Asgard, but of Terra, and in that choice, you would be bound not by my will, but by oath freely given." Thor looked around the chamber, looked at Dorn, who had shown him what it meant to lead with absolute conviction, looked at Sanguinius, whose beauty had been tempered by the terrible knowledge of his own prophecy, looked at the warriors who had bled and died to bring him to this moment. He thought of Asgardian, the blood angel who had taught him that choice was a weapon sharper than any blade, the warrior who had stood in the darkness and proven that sometimes the bravest thing was to surrender not to chaos, but to purpose. "I choose to stay," Thor said, and his voice was steady. "Not because I am bound by oath or by power or by the weight of your will, Emperor, but because I have learned that home is not a place you return to. Home is the warriors standing beside you. Home is the walls you choose to defend. Home is the brother you remember every time you stand in darkness and refuse to break." The Emperor inclined his head slowly. "Then that choice binds you deeper than any magic or technology could achieve. You are no longer Thunderer of Asgard. You are Thor, first guardian of Terra. Your hammer will remain sealed in the Bifrost wound, holding that gate closed for as long as this world endures. And when the end comes, and all things must end, you will fall as you have chosen to live, standing." A vox burst crackled through the chamber, urgent and precise. All positions report. The Warmaster is retreating. Full tactical withdrawal toward the orbital approaches. Main traitor fleet is breaking formation. We estimate 20 minutes to complete disengagement. Dorn rose to his feet. The siege is broken, my Emperor. The walls hold. Terra endures. For now, the Emperor replied, and there was something in that phrase that suggested he saw further than present moment, that his gaze extended into futures that other minds could not quite comprehend. The Warmaster will gather his forces. He will return. But not today. Today, we have proven that even gods can bleed. Even primarchs can fall. Even the promise of infinite power cannot overcome the simple, absolute refusal to surrender. The Emperor's eyes closed, and his breathing became more labored. The effort of remaining conscious in his current state was clearly immense. Go. See to your warriors. Tend to your wounds. Let the survivors know that they have bought Terra 10,000 years of peace, however much or however little that may prove to be. As the warriors filed out of the chamber, as they ascended through levels of the palace that would begin the long, slow work of recovery and reconstruction, Thor remained behind. He stood before the throne of binding and looked at the Emperor, not as a god looks at a god, but as a warrior looks at another warrior who has stared into the abyss and refused to flinch. Will you survive? Thor asked quietly. I endure, the Emperor replied without opening his eyes. That is all any of us can do. Endure, hold, and hope that what we build lasts longer than we do. A pause. Your hammer remains bound in the Bifrost wound. It will sing there for 10,000 years or more, holding back the darkness. When it finally breaks, when the seal finally fails, you will know that the end is coming. And what then? Thor asked. Then, the Emperor said, you will make the choice that defines what comes after, as all things must eventually choose. Thor left the chamber, ascending through stone and steel toward the surface where his brothers were already beginning the work of counting losses and identifying survivors. The siege of Terra was broken. The traitor forces were in full retreat, and for the first time in months, the palace was not under constant assault. But as Thor emerged onto the walls where he had spent so much blood and earned so much wisdom, he could feel Mjolnir singing far below. The hammer's voice was mournful and patient both, a reminder that no victory was permanent, that all seals eventually failed, that the darkness was patient and infinite and always, always waiting for the moment when vigilance faltered. He found Dorn standing on the Eternity Gate, looking out at the traitor fleet breaking apart in the orbital void. The Praetorian did not turn as Thor approached. You chose well, Dorn said quietly. Most warriors, given the opportunity to return home, would have taken it without hesitation. Asgard is gone, Thor replied. Not destroyed, perhaps, but changed beyond recognition by the time I spent here. And home. He gestured toward the warriors moving through the palace. Home is where brothers stand beside you in darkness. Home is the walls you choose to defend. Home is the oaths you make freely and keep even when keeping them costs everything. Then you understand what it means to be a warrior of Terra, Dorn said. He turned to face Thor, and for just a moment, the god saw something almost like approval in those grey eyes. Welcome, Thor, to whatever comes next. They stood together on the wall as the sun rose over a palace that had endured. Behind them, the work of recovery had already begun. Medici teams tended to the wounded. Engineers assessed structural damage. Priests began preparing the fallen for the rites of remembrance. And the defenders, bloodied, exhausted but unbroken, began the long process of understanding that they had survived. Not won, perhaps, but survived. And sometimes that was enough. Far below, in a sealed chamber at the Bifrost's heart, Mjolnir pulsed with steady, eternal light. The hammer sang its patient song, and the gate remained closed, and Thor, Thunderer of Terra, stood on the walls and watched the dawn break over a world that was changed forever by the simple fact of his arrival. 5 years passed like the turning of great wheels, each rotation grinding away at certainties and rebuilding the palace in new configurations of purpose and meaning. Thor walked the walls in all seasons, through rain that fell like accusations and sun that burned with the intensity of a god's anger. He trained new defenders, warriors born after the siege, who knew the conflict only through stories and scars. He stood watch in the darkness, listening for threats that never quite manifested but were never truly absent either. And he carried the weight of Asgardian's memory like a second skeleton beneath his skin. The Warmaster had indeed returned, as Dawn had predicted. 3 times in the 5 years following the siege, Horus had gathered sufficient force to mount new assaults on the palace. Each time he was driven back, each time the loyalist defenders held, and each time a little more of the Warmaster's certainty was worn away, not destroyed, but diminished, like stone slowly eroding beneath the patient assault of water. The Emperor remained in the throne of binding, his consciousness spreading across the Imperium through psychic means, his body enduring in a state that was neither quite life nor quite death. But his will remained absolute, and through him, humanity held its fragmented domain together against the infinite hunger of chaos. Thor had become something between myth and legend. The warriors of Terra told stories about the god who had arrived in lightning and chosen to stay. Stories that grew with each retelling, exaggerations that somehow contained more truth than the bare facts could ever communicate. Children born in the palace's shadow spoke his name as though it were a prayer. But Thor himself remained quiet, reflective, shaped by the siege into something harder and more weathered, like stone worn smooth by centuries of wind. It was on a winter morning 5 years and 17 days after the siege's breaking that Rogel Dawn called him to the Praetorium one final time. The Praetorian stood before a tactical display showing the Imperium in fragmentary form, worlds connected by threads of warp communication that grew more tenuous with each passing year. Dawn had aged in a way that even enhanced physiology could not quite prevent. His armor bore scars that had never been fully repaired, left as reminders of what the siege had cost. His eyes held the weight of knowing that the victories he had won were holding actions, buying time for a war that would continue long after he was dust. "I am leaving Terra," Dawn said without preamble. "The Emperor has released me from my obligation to remain as Praetorian. He has given me permission to consolidate what remains of my legion and depart to the Segmentum Solar, where I will establish a fortress monastery and continue the work of holding back the darkness in isolation." Thor felt something shift in his chest. "You are abandoning the palace." "I am accepting that my role here has concluded," Dawn corrected. "The palace is no longer under siege. The traitor forces have been driven back, and my presence here has become ceremonial rather than strategic." The Praetorian paused. "Before I depart, I needed to speak with you, to offer you choices." "I have already made my choice," Thor said quietly. "I remain on these walls." "You could remain in a different capacity," Dawn continued. He gestured, and the tactical display shifted to show the Imperium's outer reaches, the Segmentum Solar, and, beyond it, the vast darkness where chaos held sway. "I am taking volunteers who wish to continue the fight. Warriors who understand that the siege was merely the opening move in a war that will rage across millennia. I am offering you a position as my second in command, a place at my side as we build something that can hold back the darkness beyond the walls of Terra." Thor considered the offer with the seriousness it deserved. To leave would be to abandon what he had chosen. To stay would be to accept a role that was primarily ceremonial, a god worshipped rather than a warrior fighting. "I will remain," Thor said finally, "not because I do not trust you, Lord Dawn, or because I doubt your cause, but because I made an oath to these walls. I promised that I would stand upon them until the end. That is not a promise I made lightly, and it is not one I will break." Dawn nodded slowly, as though he had expected this answer, and was both relieved and saddened by it. "Then I leave the palace in your care. You are invested with full authority to maintain the walls, coordinate defenses, and make whatever decisions you deem necessary to ensure Terra's survival. The Emperor recognizes your position, and his will binds all who serve beneath these stones to obey your commands." "I do not want that responsibility," Thor said. "I know," Dawn replied, "which is precisely why you are the only choice I would trust with it." The Praetorian extended his gauntlet in the warrior's greeting, and Thor clasped it. For a moment, two leaders, one human, one god, one born to command, one who had stumbled into leadership through circumstance and sacrifice, stood in silent acknowledgement of what they had endured together. "Asgardian spoke of you in his final moments," Thor said. "He said that he understood what it meant to be bound by honor and that his death would be a gift to those he loved. I did not understand then what he meant. I understand now." "The Blood Angels are my brothers," Dawn replied. "All of them, even those who fell, even those who broke. They remain with us in the scars we carry and the lessons we have learned." He released Thor's gauntlet. "Sanguinius remains on Terra, you know. The Emperor requested that he stay, that he serve as a voice of hope in the darkness. The angel visits the walls sometimes, and I believe he speaks with you." "He does," Thor acknowledged. "He tells me stories of Asgardian, of the brother he remembers, the warrior Asgardian became, the sacrifice Asgardian made. He grieves, but the grief is mixed with something else, pride perhaps, or understanding that some losses are the price of victory." Dawn moved toward the chamber's threshold. "Then you are not alone in your burden. Remember that. The palace holds not just because of your strength, but because of the warriors who stand beside you. Honor them. Remember them, and when the end comes, and it will come, for all things end eventually, fall as Asgardian fell, with purpose, with certainty, with the knowledge that your sacrifice buys time for those who come after." "Will you return?" Thor asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Perhaps," Dawn replied, "when the darkness presses too close to the outer fortresses, when we need a reminder of what we are fighting to preserve, when the bonds of brotherhood call too loud to ignore." He paused at the threshold, but that day is not yet. For now, hold the walls, stand the watch, and remember that you are not merely guarding stone. You are guarding the last true civilization humanity has built. Everything we have, everything we are, everything we might yet become, it all depends on warriors willing to bleed on these walls. He departed, and Thor watched him go. In the hours that followed, the Praetorian of Terra made his formal farewells and led what remained of the 7th Legion toward the orbital docks. The massive strike cruisers rose from the palace grounds and broke orbit, heading toward the distant fortress monasteries where Dawn would spend the next 10,000 years holding back the darkness in isolation. As the ships disappeared into the void, Thor felt the full weight of his new role settle upon him. The palace was his to defend now, not as a warrior among warriors, but as the leader of the defense. The burden of command, which he had never sought and never truly wanted, was now his to bear until the end of time or the end of Terra, whichever came first. That night, Thor climbed to the highest point in the palace, the great golden spire that served as both beacon and monument. From there, He could see across the entire throne world. The fires of war had faded. The constant bombardment had ceased. But the scars remained. Ruined buildings that would never be rebuilt. Streets where blood had soaked so deep into the stone that no amount of cleaning could erase it. The particular devastation that only warfare could create. And far below, in the sealed chamber at the Bifrost wound, he could feel Mjolnir singing its patient song. The hammer that had defined his purpose, that had carried him through centuries of battle, that was now bound to the ceiling of a gate between worlds. It pulsed with the particular rhythm of eternity, patient, enduring, waiting for the day when its purpose would be fulfilled. Thor looked out at the palace and the city beyond it, and he understood what it meant to be truly alone. Not without companionship. There were warriors and priests and servants throughout the palace who would follow his commands and stand beside him in darkness, but alone in the weight of ultimate responsibility, alone in the knowledge that the choice to remain would define everything that came after. He raised his hands to the sky, and for just a moment, he could feel the lightning stirring in the clouds above. The storm that had carried him to Terra all those years ago seemed to recognize him still, seemed to acknowledge the god who had chosen to become something more than a god. "Watch over us," Thor whispered to the stars, to the Emperor in his throne, to Dawn as he sailed toward distant battles, to Asgardian, resting in whatever afterlife awaited warriors who had given everything. "Watch over these walls, watch over these people. For I will hold, I will stand, I will endure." And in the darkness far below, Mjolnir sang in response, a song of thunder and purpose, of sacrifice and choice, of a god who had learned to be a man, and in that learning had found something more valuable than immortality. The siege was over, but the watch, the eternal, patient watch, was just beginning. 10,000 years is a long time to stand watch. The palace of Terra endured. Through wars and betrayals, through the slow strangulation of the Imperium by its own bureaucracy and corruption, through ages where the light of human civilization grew dimmer with each passing century, the walls held. And Thor remained, not quite mortal, not quite immortal, existing in the space between as something that should not have been possible, but was. The Emperor remained in the throne of binding, his consciousness spread impossibly thin across a galaxy that had largely forgotten him, his body sustained by technologies that no longer fully functioned, his will the only force holding the fragmenting Imperium together. Dawn did return many times, his visits growing rarer as the millennia accumulated. Each time he came, he brought stories of distant wars and impossible struggles. Each time he left, Thor understood a little more deeply what it meant to be a god playing at being a warrior. Sanguinius never left. The angel remained on Terra, his presence a constant reminder that even the most beautiful of the Emperor's creations was bound by prophecy and doom. He and Thor would stand together on the walls in the long nights, two immortals watching over a world that grew steadily older and more fragile. Sometimes Sanguinius would speak of Asgardian. Sometimes he would speak of the end he had foreseen, a final battle where even the walls would not be enough. But mostly they stood in silence, two warriors who understood that some vigils lasted longer than civilization itself. The Bifrost scar held. Mjolnir's voice grew quieter over the centuries, the hammer's power slowly but inexorably diminishing as the seal it maintained began its inevitable degradation. Thor could feel it, a fading, a weakening, the slow approach of a day when the gate would need a new sealing or would burst open entirely. The demon that had worn his father's face had been right about one thing. All things eventually ended. All seals eventually failed. All walls eventually fell, but not yet. Not for 10,000 years. Not for long enough that Thor watched the palace's stones grow smoother from the wind and rain, watched the bloodstains fade until only legends remained to mark where warriors had died. Not for long enough that a new civilization grew up in the palace's shadow, one that knew Thor only as a myth, as a god thing that dwelt on the walls, and sometimes spoke prophecies that echoed strangely in the ears of mortals. In the final hours, as the Bifrost scar began its ultimate collapse, as Mjolnir's song grew thin enough to hear only in dreams, Thor made his final choice. He descended alone into the sealed chamber where his hammer had held the gate closed for 10 millennia. He placed his hands upon Mjolnir, and he felt the weapon's weariness, the exhaustion of holding back infinity, of resisting the infinite pressure of the warp's hunger, of remaining true to a purpose long after the god who had wielded it had learned to be something else. "Rest," Thor whispered to the hammer. "You have earned that much." He pulled Mjolnir free. The gate opened. But it did not open onto Asgard. That realm had fallen long ago, its remnants scattered across the void. Instead, it opened onto something that was all realms at once, and none of them. The Bifrost itself, the bridge between worlds, restored to its full glory by the simple act of releasing the seal that had constrained it. And from that bridge stepped a figure clad in armor that burned with starlight and memory. Not Odin, not a ghost, but something that remembered being Odin, that carried the weight of centuries as a progenitor, that stood between the worlds as a guardian of what had been and what might yet be. "My son," it said, and there was both sorrow and pride in the words. "You have held these walls for longer than any god was meant to hold anything. You have paid a price that no being should pay. And you have done so freely, without asking for salvation or promise of reward." "Who are you?" Thor asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I am what remains of Asgard," the figure replied. "I am the collective will of all those who fell, given form to speak to you in this final moment. I am your people, Thor. And I have come to offer you the choice that should have been offered 10,000 years ago." The figure extended a hand, not toward dominion but toward liberation. "Return with me. Rejoin what remains of our people. Rebuild Asgard in the deep places where chaos cannot reach or remain. Stand the final watch. Fall with this world when the end comes, as all things must eventually come to end." Thor looked at the offered hand, looked back at the hammer he held, looked toward the upper levels where warriors still stood on the walls, still defended a palace that grew older with each passing day. He thought of Ascalon, who had taught him that some choices transcended survival. He thought of Dawn, who had shown him what it meant to hold even when holding seemed impossible. He thought of the Emperor in his throne, enduring not because he wished to endure, but because his will alone held back the darkness. He thought of home. "I have already made my choice," Thor said simply. "I made it 10,000 years ago when I sealed the Bifrost. I made it when I chose these walls over my people. I make it again now, freely and with full knowledge of what it means." The figure that remembered Odin nodded slowly. "Then we will endure in other forms. We will watch from the deep places. And when Terra at last falls, when even the walls prove insufficient and the darkness pours across this world like a tide, we will remember you. We will remember the God who became a man. We will remember the choice you made." The figure turned to step back onto the Bifrost, and the bridge began to fade. "When the end comes, Thor, Thunderer of Terra, you will not stand alone. We will stand with you, in memory, in spirit, in the bonds of blood that transcend death and distance and time itself." "Then I am not truly abandoned," Thor said. "You are never abandoned," the figure replied. "Not by those who love you, not by those who understand what your sacrifice means. You are abandoned only if you abandon yourself." The Bifrost scar sealed itself, not with Mjolnir holding it closed, but with the simple closure of a bridge that had served its purpose. The hammer remained in Thor's grip, but it was quiet now, no longer singing, no longer burning with divine purpose. Just a weapon, ancient and beautiful, waiting for the final battle. Thor climbed back toward the surface, back toward the walls where his brothers stood eternal watch. When he emerged into the light of a sun that had grown old in its burning, when he stood once more on the stones that had become his home, he found Sanguinius waiting. The angel looked at him with golden eyes that saw too much, that understood too deeply. "It is time," Sanguinius said simply. "I know," Thor replied. "I can feel it. The walls are failing. The darkness is pressing closer. The age of the Imperium is ending." "Not ending," Sanguinius corrected. "Transforming. What comes after will be terrible and beautiful and strange in ways we cannot yet comprehend, but it will endure. Because we chose to hold. Because we refused to break." They stood together on the walls as the sky turned colors that had no names. In the distance, the traitor fleet, ancient now, corrupted beyond recognition, piloted by things that were no longer quite demon and no longer quite human, began its final approach. Behind it came the darkness itself, the infinite hunger of chaos given form and purpose, the accumulated rage of 10,000 years of resistance, suddenly released like a flood breaking through a dam. The final siege was beginning, but Thor, Thunderer of Terra, standing on walls that had been his home for 10,000 years, raised Mjolnir one final time. The hammer blazed with light that was pure and terrible and absolute. And across the palace, warriors who had never known a time when this god was not watching over them took up their weapons and prepared for the last battle. The walls would hold a little longer, not forever. All things end eventually, but long enough. Long enough for one more dawn. Long enough for one more story to be told. Long enough to prove that even against the infinite, a single warrior standing firm could make all the difference. And in the moment before the storm broke, as lightning gathered in the clouds, and Thor raised his voice in defiance against the encroaching darkness, something ancient and vast stirred in the warp. A memory of thunder, an echo of choice. The ghost of a god who had learned to be a man, and in that learning had become something far greater than either alone. Asgard had fallen, but its lightning lived on in the heart of a warrior who refused to break. And that in the end was all any god or man could truly ask for.